What would you do if you discovered two beings that have no right to exist, ensnared in wire and sobbing like small children? That was the very question Marcus Thompson had roughly 30 seconds to resolve on a February morning, so frigid it pained him to draw a breath. Marcus was 63 years old, a retired wildlife officer who had dedicated 40 years to tracking everything from black bears to mountain lions across the Cascade Range. He was certain he had witnessed it all. That was his belief. Because what he discovered caught in his fence line that morning, two small figures cloaked in dark fur, with eyes too knowing to be animal, too terrified to be anything but alive, shattered every conviction he held about what roamed the forests of eastern Oregon. This is not some tale of a fleeting glimpse in the shadows. This is what unfolds when a man who values evidence above all else is confronted with the undeniable proof. Now, I can guess what's on your mind. Sasquatch legends. We've all been told them. Hazy photographs, dubious footprints, campfire stories that stretch taller with every retelling. Marcus held the same opinion. He spent 4 decades shaking his head at tourists who swore they glimpsed something moving in the trees. But this is the truth about skeptics. They become the most credible witnesses. Because when a man who refuses to believe finally sees, truly and clearly, you know it's the real thing. Marcus resided by himself in a cabin located about 15 miles from Bend, Oregon, where the pine forests grew so dense you could wander for days and never encounter another person. His wife, Linda, had passed away 3 years prior, a swift and cruel cancer, and he had sought refuge up here, where the quiet didn't pass judgment on him for speaking to her photograph each morning. The cabin was situated at the end of a dirt road that became mud in the spring and a sheet of ice in the winter, encircled by 200 acres of timber and scrub he had acquired when land was affordable and dreams were vast. Now, it was just him, a 12-year-old hound named Buster, whose coat was more grey than brown, and an expanse of solitude sufficient to either mend your spirit or shatter it, all depending on your nature. Just a quick note, if you're finding this story compelling, please hit that like button. It genuinely assists the algorithm in sharing these narratives with others who are drawn to the strange and the unexplained. It also signals to me that you're eager for more stories like this one. In any case, let's return to that February morning. The cold was vicious. It gnawed through Marcus's jacket, wormed its way between his ribs, and settled deep in his bones as if it intended to make a home there. He had awoken at 5:30. As he always did, some routines persist long after their reason is gone, and brewed coffee in the pre-dawn gloom, observing the frost-etched patterns on the kitchen window like charts to non-existent lands. The radio announced 14 degrees, but the thermometer on his porch registered 11, and Marcus placed more faith in what he could see with his own eyes than in what strangers relayed through crackling static. For a week, he had been intending to inspect the fence line that ran along the lower pasture. Something had been trespassing on his land, churning up the soil and leaving tracks that were too large for deer and shaped incorrectly for elk. He figured it was likely a bear, roused from hibernation too soon and disoriented by the unseasonable warm spell they'd experienced in January. Nature seemed to have forgotten its own timetable. The scientists were calling it climate change. Marcus simply called it unnatural. He drank his coffee while standing another ingrained habit from years of consuming it in the cabs of trucks and at ranger stations, where to sit down meant you might not stand again for hours. Linda used to gently mock him for it. "You drink coffee as if it's a prescription," she would say. And perhaps it was. Perhaps that was the only thing that kept a 63-year-old man in motion when his knees ached with the changing weather, and his back held a grudge for every time he'd lifted something heavier than common sense. Aloud, Buster observed him from his bed near the wood stove, one ear pricked up, the other permanently flopped over since a close encounter with a porcupine back in 2009. The old dog had certainly earned his rest. On some mornings, Marcus found himself envying him the uncomplicated existence of eating, sleeping, and never questioning the purpose of it all. But then Buster would gaze at him with those hazy eyes that still contained a flicker of devotion, and Marcus would be reminded of why people keep dogs to begin with. Someone should believe you're important, even if it's only because you're the one who fills the food bowl. "You stay put, old fella," Marcus murmured, shrugging into his heavy coat. "This kind of weather isn't for you anymore." The dog's tail gave a single thump against the wooden floor. It could have been agreement, or perhaps just acknowledgement. It was hard to be sure. Outside, the entire world was draped in white. It wasn't new snow, they hadn't seen any for a week, but a frost so dense, it appeared as though someone had coated every surface with a layer of paint. The pine trees stood as stark, dark silhouettes against it, shadows pretending to have substance. His breath billowed out in plumes that lingered in the air like the ghosts of unspoken words. The ATV was parked under the lean-to, its seat covered in a fine layer of ice crystals. He swept them away with a gloved hand and mounted the vehicle, his knees groaning in protest. The engine sputtered, went silent, sputtered again, and then roared to life with a sound like a burst of fury. He allowed it to warm up as he double-checked his tools: wire cutters, pliers, a staple gun, and a box of fence staples. And a first aid kit, because at his age, you learn that mishaps never wait for an opportune moment. The journey down to the lower pasture lasted 20 minutes, following a path he had carved into the land over the course of decades. The cold rendered everything fragile. Branches snapped under the ATV's tires with the sound of breaking bones. The sky was a pale, washed-out grey that signaled sunrise was making an effort, but had not yet persuaded the darkness to retreat. This was the time of day Marcus cherished most, when the world was still in the process of deciding what it would become. A sense of possibility resided in those transitional moments, as fleeting and delicate as the frost itself. He discovered the damage roughly halfway along the fence line. Initially, he assumed it was merely another broken post, one more task to be added to the endless list of repairs that never seemed to shrink. But then his eyes fell on the wire. It hadn't been snipped. It had been torn, ripped clean from the posts and stretched taut across the ground as if someone had seized it with both hands and pulled with all their might until something had to give. The metal was still anchored at both ends, but was horribly twisted. The barbs, bent at angles that suggested immense force, had been applied with no regard for the outcome. Marcus cut the engine and dismounted with the slow deliberation of a man whose body has made it abundantly clear that sudden movements come with a price paid later in aches, stiffness, and nights where sleep is a reluctant visitor. He knelt beside the wire, slipped off one glove, and laid a hand on the metal. It was so cold it felt like a burn. The frost that coated it had melted in spots and then refrozen, forming intricate patterns like snowflakes embedded in the steel. Something had been right here. And very recently, he leaned in to examine the wooden fence post closest to the breach. Deep gouges scarred one side, 4 parallel marks spaced about 1 inch apart. This was not the work of weather, nor was it caused by any tool he could identify. In his career, he had seen countless claw marks, bears etching their territory, cougars honing their claws on tree bark, even wolverines leaving their mark on anything that remained stationary for too long. But these were different, deeper. The spacing was all wrong. Too wide for a bear's forepaw, yet too narrow for its hind paw. And the depth of them, whatever created these marks, had done so with incredible weight behind the action. A sound sliced through the morning stillness. It was faint, distant, nearly swallowed by the whisper of the wind, sifting through the pines. Marcus went rigid, one hand still resting on the fence post, listening with the focused intensity you use when you're not certain you've heard anything at all. And there it was again, a cry. It was feeble and unsteady, like something in pain trying to summon help it had no hope of receiving. His immediate thought was a coyote. They could produce deceptive sounds, yips and wails that, in the darkness, could sometimes sound eerily human. But this was not that. It possessed a rhythm, a certain cadence that implied a thinking mind behind it. This was not the mindless sound of an animal's agony. It was something more. Marcus rose to his feet, his joints groaning in chorus with the frozen trees that surrounded him. He retrieved his rifle from the ATV's rack, an old lever-action Winchester that had belonged to his father, and to his father's father before him. He doubted he would need it, but 40 years in the wild had taught him that the items you assume you won't need are often the very ones you end up desperately wishing you had brought. It was better to bear the weight of the rifle than the weight of regret. He followed the sound across the pasture, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened grass. The crying intensified as he advanced, becoming more distinct. He could now discern 2 separate voices, one with a higher pitch, the other lower, both sounding faint with exhaustion, injury, or sheer terror, perhaps all 3. They were very near, just beyond the tree line, where the pasture yielded to the forest and the shadows congregated, dense enough to conceal any secret. The scent reached him before he saw a thing. It was musky, primal, like the smell of a wet dog blended with something else, the scent of damp earth, sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. It was potent enough to make his eyes water, yet familiar enough to trigger alarms in the ancient part of his brain that still remembered a time when humans knew to be afraid of the dark. Then, he detected movement. Low on the ground, a desperate struggle. Marcus halted, bringing the rifle up halfway before lowering it once more. His hands had begun to tremble, but it was no longer from the biting cold. Not anymore. There, ensnared in a tangled web of his own barbed wire that had been ripped free and dragged into the woods, were two small figures. For a moment, his mind scrambled to classify them as something familiar, perhaps bear cubs or young elk that had become caught in the fence they were trying to leap over. But his eyes knew better. His eyes had always been brutally honest with him, even when he wished they weren't. They were cloaked in dark brown fur, thick and matted with ice crystals and dried blood. They stood about 3 feet tall, maybe slightly more. Their bodies were stocky and powerfully built. Despite their small stature, shaped like wrestlers or gymnasts, all their strength condensed into a compact frame. But it was their faces that made Marcus's heart stop. They were part human, part something entirely other. They had broad noses, heavy brow ridges, and eyes that stared at him with an expression he recognized from very different circumstances. It was the look of a being that knows it is utterly helpless, and despises that fact. The smaller of the two was lying on its side, a length of wire wrapped so tightly around one leg that the fur had been worn away, revealing raw skin beneath. This was the one producing the high-pitched cries, a sound that oscillated between pure pain and abject fear. The larger one, still small by any standard, but bigger than its companion, had wire twisted around both of its arms and across one shoulder. It was desperately trying to reach the smaller creature, straining against the metal that bound it, each movement causing the barbs to bite deeper into its own flesh. When the larger creature noticed Marcus, it became perfectly still. Its eyes a deep, dark brown, almost black, fixed on his, with a piercing intensity that made him want to turn away. And then, it did something that fundamentally altered Marcus's entire perception of the world. It formed a word. It wasn't language, not any human tongue, but it was a sound that possessed a definite architecture, a purpose, a deep, resonant rumbling that ebbed and flowed with what could only be called a syntax. It was an attempt to communicate, a warning perhaps, or a plea for aid. Marcus couldn't decipher which. It might have been both. His hands were trembling undeniably now. The rifle felt like an anchor in his grasp. His breath, a series of shallow, rapid puffs, materialized in the frigid air, separating him from these impossible beings. Every survival instinct honed over 40 years screamed at him to retreat slowly, to reach the ATV, flee to the cabin, and then force himself to believe it was a hallucination. Old men imagined things. Linda had been gone for 3 years. Grief was a master of illusion. The mind, desperate to fill a void with something, anything, even a phantom born of unreality. Yet the blood was undeniably real. The wire biting into their flesh was real, and the smaller one's cries had faded in the mere few minutes he had stood there, a witness to his own worldview, crumbling like a rotten fence post in a deluge. For his entire adult life, Marcus Thompson had operated on a foundation of evidence and reason. He trusted only what he could measure, document, and prove. He had dismissed hundreds of Sasquatch reports with the same courteous skepticism he reserved for UFO sightings and ghost stories. They were folklore, wishful thinking, the human compulsion to believe in the magical because the mundane was often too much to bear. And yet, here he was, staring at a pair of creatures that every book he had ever consumed insisted could not be, watching them bleed out on his property line, while they produced sounds that felt engineered to shatter something vital within his chest. He lowered the rifle until it pointed at the earth. He leaned it against a tree. He stripped off his gloves. "Easy now," he rasped, his voice a harsh blend of cold and an emotion far more profound. "I am not going to harm you." The larger creature grew taut, its muscles bunching beneath a coat of dark fur. Yet it made no move to escape. Perhaps it was unable. Perhaps the wire held it too securely. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that terrified Marcus more than any other, perhaps it understood him. He knelt with agonizing slowness, each joint protesting the cold, and drew the wire cutters from his belt. The sharp scrape of metal on metal caused both creatures to flinch, but Marcus maintained a steady, deliberate pace. He had liberated countless animals from snares and fences over the years. This was the same procedure. Approach slowly, speak in a calm tone, and avoid any movement that could be misinterpreted as an attack. Except, this was not the same thing at all, and every being in that clearing knew it. He began with the smaller one. It was in a more dire state, the wire cutting a deep groove into its leg, fresh blood seeping through the matted fur. Up close, Marcus could discern details that were invisible from a distance. The hands, and they were unequivocally hands, not paws, bore 5 fingers each, thick and powerful but undeniably human in their structure. They had nails, not claws. The feet were wide and flat, with calloused soles that told a story of a lifetime spent walking barefoot. And the face, dear God, the face was so hauntingly close to human that to look at it felt like gazing into some ancient, evolutionary mirror, seeing a path humanity might have taken had it veered left instead of right in the primordial mists. The wire was coiled 3 times around the leg, each loop digging deeper than the one before. Marcus positioned the cutters with immense care, trying to ignore how near his own fingers were to hands that could likely pulverize bone. The creature tracked his every move, its breathing sharp and shallow, its eyes locked on his face. "Just hold still," Marcus murmured, the words feeling more like a prayer. "I've almost got it." The first wire parted with a sharp crack that resonated in the frozen silence. The creature flinched, but held its position. Marcus severed the second wire, and then the third. The leg fell free, trailing blood that seemed too vividly red against the white frost, too human for his peace of mind. The larger creature had stopped its struggle entirely. It observed Marcus with an expression he could not fully decipher, a mixture of apprehension and something that could have been hope, or perhaps it was calculation. It was impossible to tell. He moved to it next, kneeling in the frost that was already seeping through the denim of his jeans, making his old knees ache in a way that would serve as a reminder for days to come. This one was bound by wire around both arms, wrapped so tightly that the fur was compressed and the skin underneath was turning a dark, bruised color. Marcus worked meticulously, cutting close to its body, forcing himself not to dwell on what he was doing, what he was kneeling beside, and what it meant that these things shared the same world where he paid property taxes, bought groceries, and spoke to his late wife's photograph each morning as if she might just answer back. The wire came away piece by agonizing piece. Each cut elicited a sound from the creature, not quite relief, not quite pain, but something in between that made Marcus's own chest ache with a hurt that had nothing to do with the cold. When the last segment of wire dropped to the ground, the larger creature did not bolt. It did not lunge. It simply sat there in the frost, breathing heavily, and looked at Marcus with eyes that held so much awareness that he could no longer pretend this was just another animal. The smaller one made an attempt to stand, struggled halfway up, and then collapsed with a noise like breaking glass. Its leg would no longer bear its weight. The damage was too severe. Too much blood had been lost. Marcus saw the tremor that ran through its body, the onset of shock, or hypothermia, or both. He rose to his feet, his gaze shifting back toward the ATV waiting in the pasture. He looked at these two beings that every logical fiber of his being told him to abandon right here, to let nature run its course, to go home and erase this memory. The world had operated according to a specific set of rules for all of his 63 years. To change those rules now felt like an invitation to chaos. But Linda's voice reached him across 3 years of silence and solitary winter mornings, something she had said near the end, when the medicine made her philosophical and the pain made her brutally honest. The world is full of things that don't make sense, Marcus. That doesn't mean they aren't important. He pulled off his thick coat, ignoring the brutal shock of the cold that struck him like a physical blow. He wrapped it around the smaller creature, which was now shivering so violently he could hear its teeth chattering, if they were teeth, if that was even the correct term. Then he stooped and lifted it into his arms. It was heavier than it appeared. Solid muscle beneath the fur and the terror. It made a small sound of surprise, perhaps, or protest, but it did not resist. The larger one staggered to its feet, unsteady, clearly favoring the shoulder where the wire had cut deepest. It made that rumbling sound again, quieter this time, questioning. Marcus met its gaze. "Come on, then," he said. "You'll die out here, and I can't." He broke off. He couldn't complete the sentence because he no longer knew what it was he couldn't do. Couldn't walk away, couldn't abandon them. couldn't unsee what he had witnessed. He couldn't go back to the world where these beings didn't exist, where he was just a lonely old man waiting to join his wife in whatever lay beyond. The larger creature followed him toward the ATV. It was limping, leaving behind tracks in the frost that would vanish by noon, disappearing as if they had never been there at all. Like evidence that could not sustain its own weight, Marcus gently placed the smaller one in the trailer he had been towing, covering it with a tarp from his emergency supplies. The larger creature climbed in without any prompting, curled itself beside its companion, and pulled the edge of the tarp over them both. It was an act of intelligence, of problem-solving, of understanding the need for concealment. The ride back to the cabin felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Marcus's mind was spinning like tires on ice, finding no purchase, heading nowhere useful. What in God's name was he doing? This act violated every protocol he had ever lived by, every regulation he had ever enforced. These were unidentified animals. No, not animals, something other. Something more unsettling, because they were just human enough to make you forget they were not. He should be calling someone. The Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, hell, maybe even the National Guard. This was something far beyond his purview. Beyond his small parcel of Oregon forest and his empty cabin, and his life that had contracted to coffee, memories, and conversations with a photograph. But he made no move for his radio. He did not reach for his cell phone. He just drove through the frozen morning, while two creatures that shouldn't exist huddled in his trailer, bleeding and terrified, and, for reasons he could not begin to comprehend, trusting him. The cabin emerged from the tree line, just as it always had a steadfast, familiar shape now. Too vast for one man since Linda's passing, yet too steeped in her memory to abandon. From within, Buster's barks erupted, a profound baying that signaled a stranger's approach, a command to guard the homestead, a promise to earn his supper. Marcus guided the vehicle alongside the porch and silenced the motor. The quiet that rushed in to fill the void felt like the world holding its breath in anticipation. He dismounted the ATV, his very bones aching in protest against the chill, the early hour, and the gravity of choices now set in stone. The larger of the two beings nudged its head from beneath the tarp, sampling the air, its gaze sweeping over the cabin, the woods, and the sky that was fading to a pale gray with the coming dawn. "Get inside," Marcus managed to say, astonished that his voice functioned at all. Before we're spotted, the being seemed to comprehend. Or perhaps it was a convincing imitation. It was impossible to be sure. It eased itself from the trailer, mindful of its smaller companion swaddled in Marcus's jacket. It stood by patiently as he lifted the little one once more. Heavens! The creature was a dead weight, nothing but dense muscle and solid bone, and ascended the porch steps, which groaned beneath their collective mass. As Marcus nudged the door open, Buster's barking escalated to a frantic crescendo. The old hound was planted in the center of the living room, the fur on his spine erect, his teeth bared, emitting a sound that was equal parts threat and terror. Marcus had never witnessed fear in Buster before. Protective, certainly. Territorial, absolutely. But true fear. That was a first. "Settle down, boy," Marcus murmured. "Easy now. They're injured." The larger being glided through the doorway after him, its movements possessing a fluidity that belied its size. It took in the entire room with a single, sweeping look, registering the wood stove, the gun rack, the sofa that had been Linda's reading spot, and the kitchen table with a lone chair askew, a testament to a habit Marcus couldn't break. Buster's barking ceased abruptly. He fell utterly silent, his tail tucked tightly between his legs as he retreated until his back met the wall, where he slumped into a sitting position, head bowed, and ears pinned back. It was pure submission, an acknowledgement of a superior predator, something his 12 years of existence as a dog told him he must never confront. Marcus transported the smaller being to the rug before the wood stove, setting it down with all the gentleness he could muster. Its larger counterpart trailed him, knelt by its side, and began to utter soft vocalizations that could only be interpreted as a foreign speech, a language his human ears were not designed to comprehend. He remained motionless in the heart of his own home, a spectator to two impossible creatures, murmuring solace to one another next to his late wife's cherished armchair. All the while, his dog whimpered in a corner, and the percolator on the stove began to scorch, forgotten in his hasty departure. The aroma of burnt coffee mingled with the primal scent of his new house guests, the faint smoke from the stove, and the sharp, coppery note of blood. Marcus switched off the burner, tipped the spoiled coffee into the sink, and started a fresh pot. He did it because some routines persist long after their reason is gone. He did it because brewing coffee was a task he understood, in a morning where everything else had spiraled so far beyond his grasp that his hands craved a familiar motion to quell their trembling. As the new pot brewed, he retrieved his first aid kit from the bathroom. It was military surplus, a massive green satchel stocked for everything from a simple blister to a gunshot wound. He'd purchased it in the 1990s, when the Y2K scare had people certain the world would cease at midnight on January 1st, 2000. The world, of course, had not ended. It just continued on, unconcerned with human anxieties and stockpiles. But the kit had remained, and now, 2 decades on, it was poised to be used for a purpose he could never have foreseen. He knelt next to the smaller being, unzipped the kit, and took out gauze, antiseptic, and rolls of bandages. The creature observed him with eyes showing far too much white around their dark pupils, a universal sign of fear, proof that no matter its origin, it knew what pain was and yearned for it to end. "This will sting a bit," Marcus warned, speaking mainly to convince himself he wasn't descending into madness. "But it's necessary to prevent any sickness from setting in." He began with the wounds on its leg, his aged hands working with painstaking care. The creature flinched, but held still, emitting low sounds that might have been a language or simply the raw voice of its agony. It was impossible to tell. The lacerations were severe, cutting down to the muscle in several spots. They likely required stitches, but Marcus doubted his hands possessed the steadiness for such delicate work now. Bandages would have to suffice. He'd wrap them securely, keep them sterile, and pray it was enough. The larger being observed his every move. After a moment, it extended a hand its fingers thick, its palm calloused, its nails broken and soiled from a rugged existence, and gently touched the freshly tied bandage. The touch was inquisitive. Then, it raised its gaze to meet Marcus's, its expression an unreadable mix of what could have been thankfulness or a careful evaluation, as if deciding whether this man was a danger, a partner, or something else entirely. Marcus then turned his attention to the larger creature. It bore deep lacerations on both shoulders from where the wire had dug into its flesh, and a cut across its chest that appeared more dramatic than it was bleeding freely but not penetrating too deeply. He cleansed each injury, applying an antiseptic that caused the being to hiss and recoil, though it did not flee. He wound bandages around its torso and shoulders, exhausting most of his supplies until both of his guests resembled soldiers who had narrowly survived a brutal battle. The smaller one's trembling had subsided. The warmth radiating from the wood stove was working its magic, chasing away the chill and restoring a healthier hue to the skin visible under its fur. Marcus placed several large logs into the fire, ones that would provide a slow, constant heat, before stepping back to survey his handiwork. 2 unidentified beings were now in his living room. They were bandaged, growing warmer, and staring at him, as if he held the answers to what the future held. He had no idea what came next. He hadn't planned beyond this moment. His mind was still struggling to process their mere existence, much less the fact that he had brought them into his home as one might rescue stray animals seeking refuge from a storm. Marcus poured a cup of coffee, sweetening it with sugar just as Linda had always chided him for, and stood by the kitchen window to watch the sunrise over the Cascade Range. The light crept in slowly, transforming the sky from pitch black to charcoal grey, then to the soft blue that promised a new day, regardless of the last. Beyond his land, the forest unfolded for miles upon miles, a vast expanse of pine and fir, holding secrets that remained hidden simply because no one thought to look for them. His entire life had been built on a foundation of the provable. He believed in evidence, in documentation, in the scientific method. One did not simply declare something's existence without supporting data, without tangible proof that could withstand rigorous examination. And now, that very proof was resting on his living room rug, its breathing even, its body warming, its life force so undeniable. It made every scientific journal and expert opinion he had ever consumed feel like fictions crafted by those too afraid to acknowledge what stood plainly before their eyes. The larger being made a noise, and Marcus turned from the window. It was on its feet, cautiously testing its weight on legs that now seemed more stable. It moved about the room with deliberation, studying objects with the intense focus of a traveler in a strange land. It lifted the remote control from the coffee table, inspected it from all angles, and placed it back down. It brushed a hand against the lamp on the end table, captivated by the light that persisted even as the day broke. Its thick fingers traced the spines of the books on the shelf, mostly Linda's mystery novels. Their paperback covers creased, and their pages folded at corners she had wished to revisit. The creature then turned its gaze to Marcus and uttered a sound with a rising inflection, like a spoken question. "Those belong to my wife," Marcus heard himself say, uncertain why he felt the need to explain. She favored the stories where the investigator solved the case with patience and keen observation. She used to say that real life was never so neat, but a good book ought to be. The being tilted its head, listening intently. It seemed to grasp his tone, if not the words themselves. It gestured toward Marcus, then to the books, and repeated the inquisitive sound. Marcus placed his coffee mug on the counter. He walked across the room, closing the distance until he could discern details previously obscured. The creature's coat was not a single color, it was paler around its face and deeper on its arms and shoulders. Its eyes held a profound depth, a mix of brown and amber hues that reflected the lamplight. He could see scars hidden in the fur, ancient marks from wounds that had mended poorly or battles won at great expense. This was no flawless laboratory specimen. This was a living being that had endured a harsh existence through a combination of power, wit, and fortune. He gestured to his own chest. "Marcus," he articulated, slowly and clearly. The being observed the shape of his lips as they formed the name. Then, with a voice like ancient stones grinding together, it echoed the sound back to him, a gravelly whisper. "Mar-cus." A shiver traced a path up Marcus's spine, but it wasn't born of fear. It was something far deeper, the chilling realization that he had just crossed an invisible boundary, a point of no return in the story of his world. He gestured toward the creature, his gaze inquisitive, his eyebrows arched in a silent query. The creature responded by placing a wide hand upon its own chest. A sound rumbled from deep within it, a low, melodic vibration that rose and fell, a sound that felt like a name in a tongue as old as the forest itself. If they were a people, if they had a language, if the world was still the world he knew. In the burgeoning dawn, they remained locked in a silent exchange, man and myth, gazing across a chasm between worlds that was somehow, impossibly, being bridged. On the rug, the little one whimpered softly in its sleep, while Buster, his curiosity finally eclipsing his caution, tiptoed from his refuge to sample the strange, new scent hanging in the air. Beyond the cabin walls, the forest carried on with its timeless rituals. Birds sang their territorial claims, and the wind whispered secrets through the pines, the symphony of a morning that was, in every way that mattered, utterly extraordinary. The mundane thought of breakfast flickered in his mind, followed by the urge to call someone, to tell anyone, but he knew he wouldn't. Each act would unravel into a storm of questions he could never answer. Secrecy had become his companion over 3 solitary years. And what was one more? Even a secret, so monumental it could shatter the very foundations of human knowledge. The larger being drifted toward the window, its gaze fixed on the forest, with an expression of profound longing. The smaller one, a stark silhouette of white bandages against dark fur, rose to stand beside its guardian. Together they stared into the trees, and Marcus felt an undeniable certainty that they were searching for something or someone. He was on the verge of breaking the silence, though how he would even begin. He didn't know when Buster's growl cut through the quiet. It was a low, steady rumble, a warning of something amiss, but not yet a direct threat. The dog's eyes were locked on the door, the fur along its spine bristling slowly. Marcus moved to the window, peering past his 2 silent guests. At first, there was nothing but his yard, his ATV, the wall of trees beyond. Then, a flicker of motion, something immense, gliding between the trunks about 100 yards away. Its size dwarfed any deer. Its gait was too measured, too purposeful for an elk. Beside him, the larger creature let out a sharp, urgent cry. The little one huddled close, its body trembling not from the morning chill, but from a primal, instinctive fear. His hand found the binoculars on their hook by the door. He raised them, his breath held tight, and brought the distant tree line into sharp, terrifying focus. The sight that filled the lenses stole the very air from his lungs. It was another one, colossal. Standing at least 8 feet tall, perhaps even taller, with shoulders that radiated a power no human could ever possess. It patrolled the forest's edge, pausing to scrutinize the ground, the trees, the very air. As the morning sun touched its form, it revealed fur of the deepest brown, so dark it was nearly black, and so thick it softened its silhouette into a living shadow. While Marcus stared, transfixed, the giant figure lifted its head. A sound erupted from it, a call that thundered across the frosted fields, deep, resonant, and so powerful it seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. From inside the cabin came the reply, a high, desperate wail. It was the unmistakable cry of a child, lost and frightened, calling for its mother. And in that instant, a realization struck Marcus like a bolt of lightning. That's what the colossal figure was, the mother. He had brought her children into his home, treating them like lost kittens, while she was now tearing through the wilderness, driven by a maternal fury that could level mountains and shatter any man foolish enough to stand in her path. The creature beside him seized his arm, its grip anything but gentle. Fingers like steel dug into his flesh, promising bruises that would bloom over the next 2 weeks like a grim reminder. Its eyes locked onto his, a desperate cocktail of pleading and warning, and then came the sounds unmistakably a language, a torrent of urgent words that could only mean mother, or danger, or please. Marcus let the binoculars fall. The tremor returned to his hands, but this time he let it be. His reality had fractured and reformed too quickly. To pretend at stillness would be a profound dishonesty. He spoke the words into the charged air, a statement of the terrifyingly obvious. She's looking for you. He had to say it, to give the impossible a voice and make it real. The being before him nodded, a slow, deliberate dip of its head, a gesture so perfectly, achingly human that it was painful to witness. From the woods, the mother's call echoed once more, louder and alarmingly closer. She was advancing on the cabin, her every step radiating an unyielding purpose that left no space for argument. In the span of perhaps 30 seconds, Marcus had to choose his own humanity. Would he be the protector, hiding what he'd found? Or would he be the bridge, returning what was lost and praying for mercy in return? But in his heart, the choice was already made. It had been made the moment he snipped those wires. Some decisions are like that. They reach back in time, defining the past from the vantage point of the future. This was one of them. His hand closed around the familiar stock of his rifle on the rack. It wasn't a weapon, not now. It was an anchor, something solid to hold while the world dissolved into myth around him. He unlatched the door and stepped onto the porch, into a cold that bit at him with teeth of wind and fear. The mother stood at the edge of his property, having reached the tree line. She rested a massive hand on the trunk of a pine, as if it were a birthright. And perhaps it was. Perhaps this entire world was theirs, and humanity had been nothing more than arrogant tenants, oblivious to the true landlords. There was a terrible beauty to her, a vision of raw power and ancient wisdom. Her face shared the near-human cast of her young, but etched with the hardness of seasons, survival, and a depth of loss he could never comprehend. Her gaze met his across 50 yards of frosted earth, and what he saw in those eyes constricted his very throat. She knew. He could feel the certainty of it. She could likely smell her children on the air, and in that suspended moment, she was weighing his soul, judging him as friend or foe, deciding if his life would continue or if he and his cabin would be torn asunder, for standing between a mother and her young. Slowly, Marcus raised one hand, palm open and empty. The rifle remained in his other, its barrel pointed harmlessly at the ground, a gesture of peace. He prayed it was understood as such, acutely aware that to a being that could likely tear him limb from limb, the very concept of a threat might be entirely different. They are safe. His voice cut through the frigid silence, sounding small yet carrying the weight of his conviction. They were hurt, but they are safe. I'm not going to. I won't. The words died on his lips, useless. How could he possibly finish that thought? What vow could he offer that would bridge the silent chasm separating their two worlds? The matriarch advanced, one powerful step after another. Her gait was a fluid, ground-devouring roll, shrinking the space between them as Marcus's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. 40 yards became 30, then a terrifying 20. Just then, the cabin door creaked open behind him. The larger of the young ones emerged, its smaller sibling hobbling at its side. A chorus of sounds erupted from them, a tangled cry of urgency, relief, and lingering fear. The mother froze, a statue of suspense. And then, a sound tore from her that needed no language, a raw, primal cry that spoke volumes. The sound of a mother witnessing the return of her children from the brink of oblivion. The two youths rushed past Marcus, as if he were a ghost. They scrambled down from the porch, their injuries forgotten, and surged forward a clumsy, stumbling, yet desperate run across the frosted earth toward the colossal silhouette that was their mother, their sanctuary, their entire universe. She sank to her knees to receive them, enfolding them in arms, capable of splintering bone, yet her embrace was as tender as a prayer. A symphony of sounds poured from her, a melody of language, sorrow, and elation woven into one. Her massive fingers, with an astonishing grace, inspected his makeshift bandages, her eyes scanning them for every cut, every bruise, seeking confirmation that they had truly endured. From his porch, Marcus became a silent witness to a reunion that defied the boundaries of species. A scene that echoed every homecoming he had ever known, the soldier returning from a distant war, the lost child restored to a parent's arms, the small miracle born from sheer, unyielding hope. Then, the mother lifted her gaze to his. Their eyes locked across the frozen yard, and in that moment, something profound and inexplicable passed between them, an understanding, a silent acknowledgement, a debt recognized in a language far older than words. She rose to her full height, lifting her children effortlessly. They burrowed into her thick fur, murmuring soft tones of comfort and security. She took a deliberate step back towards the forest's edge, then another, a slow, purposeful retreat, carrying her family back to the sanctuary of the shadows, to whatever home meant for a species that thrived on being unseen. On the very cusp of the woods, she paused. Gently, she set her young ones down. She knelt and retrieved something from the icy earth, a stone, perfectly flat and smooth, the kind made for skimming across a summer lake. After a moment of contemplation, she turned and arced it toward Marcus, where it landed at the foot of his porch steps with a soft, final thud. When Marcus raised his eyes again, the forest had reclaimed them. Mother and children were gone, absorbed into the safety of the deep woods, as if they had been a mere illusion, a fleeting vision conjured by a mind steeped in solitude. Yet, the stone was undeniably real. Marcus descended the steps, his chilled fingers closing around it. He saw markings etched into its surface, deliberate, flowing lines forming a pattern he could not decipher, but knew instinctively was a form of script, a message, a testament. He stood there, in the quiet of his yard, clutching a token from a creature of myth, his gaze fixed on the woods that guarded its secrets more fiercely than he had ever guarded his own. The gravity of the morning seeped into his very bones, mingling with the chill, the long years, and the profound loneliness that had shadowed him since Linda's passing. Buster padded onto the porch, a low whine in his throat. The old dog looked from the tree line to Marcus, and back again, his eyes filled with a question that mirrored Marcus's own. Did any of that truly happen? "Yeah, buddy," Marcus murmured, as much to himself and the silent morning as to the dog. It really did. Back inside, he placed the carved stone on the mantelpiece, a silent companion to Linda's photograph. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The first had grown cold during the hour the universe had tilted on its axis. The tremor in his hands was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness, perhaps acceptance, or maybe simple exhaustion. It was difficult to distinguish between the two. Through the window, the forest resumed its stoic silence. Not a branch stirred, not a sound broke the stillness. It was just trees, snow, and the pale morning light, a scene as ordinary as breathing. Yet now he knew it concealed both miracles and deep-seated terror. Marcus sipped his coffee, his gaze lost in the trees. He pondered the nature of proof, of believing what your own eyes have shown you, and of the secrets you must carry alone because they defy all explanation. His mind drifted to his wife, to her words echoing through the years, that the world was woven with things that didn't need to make sense to be profoundly important. She had been right, of course. She was always right. And that was the ache he felt most sharply, the absence of the one person who could see the truth when he was blind to it, who could perceive the paths hidden just beyond his sight. A thought surfaced. Should he document this? Write it all down before memory and time eroded the sharp edges of reality, twisting it into just another tall tale. But the question wasn't just who would believe him. It was, more importantly, who deserved to. Perhaps some truths are meant to be kept. Perhaps some evidence is intended for an audience of one. Maybe the world thrives not on answers, but on its mysteries, on the deep, quiet shadows where the impossible can exist, free from the cages and scrutiny that would strip them of their wonder and reduce them to mere specimens. He finished his coffee, the simple ritual grounding him. Outside, the sun was gaining strength. The frost would vanish by midday. The tracks would melt away. The blood would be absorbed by the soil. All physical proof would fade, as it always does, leaving only the witness to bear the burden and the beauty of what they saw. His hand went to the stone on the mantel. His fingertips traced the ancient carvings. It was real, solid, a tangible piece of proof that fit in the palm of his hand, yet its profound meaning was his alone to carry. And that, he decided, would have to be enough. The rest of the morning unfolded, as it always did, a quiet expanse of hours filled with chores, routine, and the silent companionship of a dog aging in step with him. Yet, something fundamental had shifted. A burden had been lifted, or perhaps just redistributed, making the simple act of breathing feel lighter. He had protected something precious. He had made a choice that proved to be right. He had earned the trust of a being that should have seen him only as a threat. In a life that had been pared down to mere survival and recollection, this was meaning, this was purpose. Marcus Thompson, 63 years old, retired wildlife officer, widower, and a lifelong skeptic, had just witnessed undeniable proof that the world was infinitely larger and stranger than his rational mind had ever permitted. And in that realization, his own small, isolated corner of it suddenly felt a little less lonely. He lowered himself into Linda's armchair, the one he typically avoided, where the imprint of her absence was always too sharp. For the first time in 3 long years, the familiar ache wasn't so piercing. The chair was simply a chair. The cabin, a cabin. The morning, just another morning. And he was just a man who had chosen to do right, for reasons no one else needed to understand. A flicker of movement at the forest's edge caught his eye. He looked up, but it was only a deer, foraging among the winter-stripped branches. Just normal wildlife. The ordinary, beautiful rhythm of nature carrying on. He closed his eyes, allowing a profound sense of rest to wash over him. He breathed it in, feeling the stove's warmth on his skin and the solid weight of the stone in his pocket. A strange and quiet peace settled in his soul, born from the certainty that the world held secrets far beyond what could be seen, proven, or ever fully comprehended. And for the first time, in a very long time, that was more than enough. But that, of course, was never going to be the end. Situations like this never have a clean finish. They leave echoes. They create ripples. They circle back in ways you can never anticipate or prepare for. And sometimes those repercussions cause more chaos than the original event ever could. Marcus was still oblivious to all of this. He didn't realize what was already unfolding, what sequence of events he had triggered with a single compassionate act on a cold February morning. He was unaware of the hunters who had found peculiar tracks, of the biologist who had been piecing together strange reports for months, or of the journalist who sensed a story far bigger than anything the local paper ever covered. He had no idea that his peaceful existence was about to become incredibly chaotic, but he was about to find out very soon. 2 days went by as quietly as falling snow. Marcus went through his daily tasks with a new, heightened awareness of the forest that surrounded him. He mended the fence line, reinforced the posts, and strung fresh wire, paying close attention to the spacing and height. He made it stronger than it was before, creating something that would define his property but not ensnare whatever wandered by. He couldn't stop thinking about them, the 2 young ones, and their colossal mother. He wondered where their den was, how many of them roamed these woods, and how they had managed to remain undiscovered, uncatalogued, and unturned into a spectacle for so long. A part of him was more grateful than ever for his solitude, thankful that he lived far enough from town that visitors didn't just show up. He was thankful for a forest that held its secrets close. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jake Martinez appeared. Marcus heard the truck before he laid eyes on it. A powerful engine, a loud muffler, the distinct sound of someone making sure you knew they were arriving. He was splitting firewood next to the cabin when Jake's red Chevy roared up the driveway, kicking up dust and announcing its presence like a challenge. Jake was about 60 years old, with the kind of weathered face that told a story of too much sun, too much whiskey, and not enough time spent indoors contemplating consequences. He had been a hunting guide for 30 years, knew the Cascades better than anyone, and had strong opinions on wildlife management that he'd share with or without an invitation. Marcus had worked alongside him in the past, back when they were both younger, and the world seemed to make more sense. They weren't exactly friends, but they weren't enemies either. They were just two men whose paths had crossed enough to know each other. Jake got out of the truck, a rifle clearly visible in the rack mounted in his rear window. He was dressed for the wilderness, heavy-duty boots, canvas pants, and a flannel shirt under a warm vest. His grey beard was in need of a trim, and his eyes had the sharp focus of someone who spent more time observing the woods than a television screen. "Marcus," he said, his voice a gravelly greeting. "Jake." Marcus put his axe down, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're a long way out for a casual visit." "This isn't casual." Jake stepped closer, but kept a careful distance, walking with the caution of someone approaching a creature that might bolt. "I've been tracking something north of here. It's big, really big. I lost its trail 3 days ago, right near your property line." A knot tightened in Marcus's stomach. He kept his expression unreadable, a skill he'd honed over years of dealing with poachers and tourists. "There are a lot of big animals in these woods. The bears are out early this year." This was no bear. An elk, then. "We have some bulls that can weigh 8, maybe 900 pounds. Jake shook his head slowly. "I know the difference between an elk and..." He paused, as if weighing his words, deciding what to reveal. "And something else. I found tracks that don't match anything in the guidebooks. Droppings with plant matter I can't even identify. And 3 days ago, I found where something ripped through a fence, like it was made of thread." Marcus felt his chest constrict. "That was my fence. I've already repaired it. I had a feeling it was yours. That's why I'm here." Jake pulled a phone from his pocket, swiped through a few pictures, and held it out. "I found this about 50 yards from the break." The picture displayed a tuft of dark fur, caught on tree bark. It was too coarse for a deer, too long for a bear. It was the exact same color as the fur Marcus had meticulously removed from his own fence and burned in his wood stove the very next morning. "Could be anything," Marcus said, his voice flat. "It could be." Jake put the phone away. "But I don't believe that, and I have a strong feeling you don't either." They stood there in Marcus's yard, two old men who had seen enough of the wild to recognize when something was fundamentally wrong, both of them holding back what they truly suspected, because saying it aloud would make it real in a way neither of them was ready for. "Why did you come to me?" Marcus asked. "Because you have 40 years of experience in wildlife management. Because you're methodical, you're honest, and you don't leap to wild conclusions." Jake shifted his weight, and in that moment, Marcus saw another rifle in the truck bed, partially hidden by a tarp, and because Kyle Scott is missing, that name struck Marcus like a physical blow. Kyle Scott was a local, not really a kid anymore, maybe 28 or 29, who had returned to Bend after his military service. He was good with tools, and even better at being quiet. He did odd jobs around the area, generally keeping to himself. Marcus had hired him a few times for some heavy labor. Missing in what way? He didn't show up for his job at the lumber yard for 3 days straight. His girlfriend went to his house and found his truck parked, the door unlocked, and a cold cup of coffee on the stove. All his gear was gone, his backpack, GPS, and camera equipment. She thinks he went into the forest alone. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He hasn't checked in. Marcus felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Is search and rescue looking for him? They conducted an initial search, but found nothing. The county sheriff is treating it as a voluntary disappearance, they think. Kyle just wanted some time alone and will come back when he's ready. But his girlfriend says he's been obsessed lately, talking about proving something, about showing people something they would never believe. Jake let the unspoken accusation linger in the heavy air between them. Marcus felt the weight of the implications settle in. Are you saying he went after whatever left those tracks? I think Kyle Scott is a fool, Marcus. A fool who's seen too many movies and thinks he can play tracker with something that's stayed hidden for. He cut himself off, a shake of his head betraying his frustration. He's in deep, and I have a feeling you know more than you're letting on. I don't know anything, Marcus insisted, the words a shield of technical truth. He didn't know their home, their numbers, their secrets. He possessed a single, impossible fact in a wilderness of unknowns. That wasn't knowledge, it was the burden of a witness. Jake's gaze lingered on him, a silent interrogation. He finally gave a slow nod, as if Marcus's denial had confirmed his suspicions. "Look, if you see or hear anything, call me. The kid's mother is beside herself, and his girlfriend is falling apart. Whatever this is, Kyle doesn't deserve to be its price. I'll keep my eyes open. You do that." Jake started for his truck, but stopped, turning back. "And Marcus, whatever it is you saw, or think you saw, you be careful. I've walked these woods my whole life, and I've never felt the wildlife this spooked. They sense something's wrong. They're behaving like prey in a forest that hasn't had a true predator in a century." With a churn of dust and diesel fumes, Jake was gone, leaving Marcus alone with a fresh burden piled upon the old. Kyle Scott, lost. Jake Martinez, hunting. And the woods, holding secrets that were straining to break free, with or without his consent. His eyes drifted to the tree line, the last place he'd seen the mother and her children vanish. The forest stared back, an ancient, impassive entity, utterly indifferent to the trivial dramas of men. "Damn it," Marcus whispered to the empty air, to the ghost of Linda, to whatever powerful, uncaring thing resided in the deep woods. "Damn it all to hell." He gripped his axe, returning to the woodpile. Some problems were beyond his power to solve, but a log could be split, given purpose. The steel bit into the oak with a sharp, satisfying crack as he fought to banish the image of a 28-year-old kid, chasing a myth that would likely claim him long before he could ever prove it existed. He tried to silence the gnawing question of his own complicity if saving them had somehow upset a delicate balance. If his compassion had unleashed consequences he could never have foreseen and now could not contain. The wood split true. He stacked each piece with deliberate care, imposing a fragile order on a world spiraling into chaos. Sleep offered no escape that night. Marcus lay awake, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, the soft snores of Buster, a counterpoint to his racing thoughts. He pictured Kyle Scott out there, in the oppressive dark, armed with cameras and foolish hope, utterly oblivious to the danger he was courting. The frustrating part was, Marcus understood the impulse. He remembered being that young, burning with a need to uncover truths the world preferred to ignore. That fire mellows with time, replaced by the heavy wisdom that some secrets are best left buried, and some victories cost too much. But Kyle was still in that reckless season of life, where conviction is a shield against caution, where being right feels more important than being alive. At 3 a.m, Marcus finally surrendered the fight for sleep. He brewed coffee in the pre-dawn gloom, standing at the kitchen window, his eyes tracing the dance of shadows within shadows. The night transformed the woods into an entirely different beast. Unseen things emerged. The veil between the known and the impossible grew thin, eroded by the profound darkness and the lack of human eyes to enforce reality. He shrugged on his coat, took a heavy flashlight, and opened the door. The cold was a physical blow, but he hardly noticed. A primal instinct was drawing him out, a disquiet born from the certainty that action was needed, but its form remained maddeningly unclear. Buster trailed behind, his old joints stiff, his nose twitching, deciphering the night air. The dog halted at the porch steps and let out a low, uneasy whine, a clear signal that the world was not right. "I know, boy," Marcus murmured. "I feel it too." The silence of the woods was profound, but it wasn't peaceful. It was a predatory quiet, the unnatural hush that precedes a tornado or follows a tragedy. It was a silence so complete, it felt as if every cricket and nightbird was holding its breath. Marcus's flashlight beam cut a swath across the tree line, revealing only stoic pines and motionless shadows. Then it came, a low, steady growl from Buster's chest. It was a sound reserved not for squirrels or raccoons, but for moments when the natural order felt deeply disturbed. Marcus tracked the dog's rigid stare to the northern edge of his property, where the ground fell away to a dry creek bed. And there it was. A flicker of movement, swift and low to the ground, before it vanished behind a massive, fallen log. His knuckles went white on the flashlight. His free hand instinctively went to the cold steel of the pistol, tucked into his jeans, a reflex, forged in years of backcountry work, where the most dangerous predators walked on 2 legs. "Who's out there?" he shouted, his voice shattering the oppressive silence, sounding fragile and jarringly human. "You're on private land," only silence answered. Then the movement resumed, closer now, and with an unnerving deliberateness. Marcus saw a flash of dark fur, a form smaller than the mother, yet significantly larger than the infants he had rescued. Another one, The thought hit him like a physical blow. Dear God, there was another one. It emerged from the shadows, stopping a mere 30 yards from his porch. It was slighter than the mother, perhaps 6 feet tall, with a lean frame that moved with a fluid, youthful grace. It stood fully erect, arms loose at its sides, and met his gaze. Its eyes caught the flashlight's glare, shining like a deer's, but behind that reflection lay a profound intelligence that no wild animal could ever possess. Across the frozen earth and a gulf of 3 million years, they stood locked in a silent exchange. Marcus's heart pounded against his ribs with a force that felt like it could break them. This wasn't like before. That had been an act of mercy, a frantic choice made in a moment of crisis. This was a conscious act. This creature had sought him out, had deliberately chosen to reveal itself. Slowly, it lifted a hand. It was not a threat, but a clear gesture. It pointed deep into the woods, to the north, the same direction Jake had said Kyle had vanished. Then it made a sound, not the deep, guttural tones of the mother, but a higher-pitched, urgent cry filled with unmistakable distress. And in that moment, Marcus understood everything without comprehending a single word. Something was terribly wrong. His help was needed. This impossible being had come to him, seeking aid, because his past actions had marked him. He had shown himself to be different, perhaps even safe, or at the very least, a lesser danger. Lead the way. Marcus heard his own voice, a near whisper surrendering to the mystery before him. The being pivoted, its powerful, rolling stride eating up the ground as it moved toward the tree line with deceptive speed. Marcus followed on pure instinct, a moth to a cryptic flame, his flashlight beam dancing wildly with every step. Buster took a few hesitant paces, then halted at the yard's edge, a low whine escaping him. The old dog knew the boundary between his world and another, a wisdom Marcus suddenly wished he possessed. It guided him deep into the forest's embrace, flowing between the ancient trunks with an unnerving confidence in the absolute dark. Marcus blundered in its wake, his light snatching fleeting images from the blackness, a massive hand steadying itself against bark, a broad shoulder dipping beneath a branch, the rhythmic sway of a thick, dark coat. Their path led north, down the slope, to the skeletal creek bed, then east onto a familiar game trail his boots hadn't touched in far too long. His breathing grew ragged. At 63, not a spry 23, his lungs burned with every sharp intake of frigid air. As if sensing his struggle, the creature paused, a silent sentinel waiting for him to recover before resuming at a pace he could manage. It was a gesture of consideration, a profound understanding of his human frailty. After perhaps half a mile, his guide halted, raising a hand in a clear command for silence, a command Marcus felt he'd already broken with every snap and rustle he made. It pointed a long finger forward, then simply dissolved into the surrounding darkness, as if the shadows themselves had reclaimed it. Marcus swung his light in a wide arc, illuminating a familiar scene of trees, stones, and the dry wound of the creek bed. Then the beam snagged on an unnatural splash of color, bright orange fabric, a backpack, ripped asunder, its contents strewn like entrails, a sleeping bag ensnared by thorns. A digital camera, its lens shattered, lay in the earth like a forgotten, broken vow. It had to be Kyle's equipment. That garish orange pack was standard issue for hikers, a beacon for search parties. Or, he grimly considered, a warning sign for predators that stalked these woods and preferred not to be startled. His hand found the cold comfort of his pistol as he advanced, his eyes probing the darkness beyond his beam for any unseen threat. The gear was savaged, torn apart by an incredible force. The pack straps were sheared off. The sleeping bag bore deep rents the work of claws, or perhaps something far worse. Yet, there was no blood, no indication of a fight, only discarded belongings, and the ghost of pure terror in the air, a sharp, acidic scent, unique to humans fleeing for their lives. Kyle. Marcus's voice felt small, swallowed by the immense silence before the rocks threw a faint echo back at him. Kyle Scott, if you can hear me, answer. Only nothingness replied. There was only the sigh of the wind through the pines and the harsh rasp of his own breath in the frozen air. He knelt, inspecting the debris more closely. A water bottle, stomped flat, a box of granola bars, eerily untouched, and a notebook, its pages ripped out and scattered, filled with what appeared to be field notes and hurried sketches. Marcus collected a few loose leaves, his light revealing a script that devolved from meticulous observation into a desperate, almost illegible scroll. 3 days on the trail. I found signs, prints, droppings, territory markers. They exist. They truly exist. All the stories, all the whispers people called insane. It's all real. Day 4. Last night, I heard their calls. Not one, but many voices. A family? A clan? They are aware of my presence. Something has shifted. They're no longer elusive. Now they are following me, watching me. I found my camp destroyed this morning. Was it a warning? A threat? I can't be sure. The final words were a near indecipherable streak of ink. They are here. They are not dangerous. Not the monsters of legend. But another thing is out here. Something that frightens. Them. I'm moving my camp, heading for higher ground. If this is found, the sentence simply stopped, the pen having dragged across the paper as if yanked from his hand. A tremor returned to Marcus's hands, born not of cold but of a terrible understanding that settled upon him like a shroud. Kyle had found them. He'd been studying them, chronicling a discovery that would rewrite history. But then, something else had entered the equation. Something that terrified a creature that should know no fear. And Kyle had been trapped between them. A noise shattered the stillness. It was distant, yet unmistakable. A human voice, crying out for help. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air flooded Marcus's veins. The cry echoed once more, this time from further north, higher up the mountain. Kyle. He was still alive. He was still out there. He broke into a stumbling run, chasing the sound, his beam of light, a lonely spear against a darkness that felt solid and suffocating. The being that had guided him materialized at his side so silently it made him flinch. It matched his pace, a constant, untouchable presence, a guide, or perhaps a guardian. It was impossible to know. The landscape grew treacherous. His knees screamed in rebellion as he scrambled over fallen giants and skirted boulders as large as small trucks. The cold was a physical assault now, stealing the air from his lungs, making his chest ache. He was too old for this. Too old, too weary, and too damn terrified to be scaling the Oregon wilderness after a voice that could be a ghost of his own making. But then the voice cried out again, nearer this time, unquestionably. Kyle, the sound of a young man, panicked, the words themselves indistinct, but the terror within them ringing with absolute clarity. Marcus forced himself onward, silencing his body's protests, trailing the creature as it drifted ahead like smoke weaving through the trees. As they crested a ridge, the earth fell away into a narrow valley, where the canopy was so dense it choked out the stars, leaving shadows his flashlight could barely penetrate. And there, nestled in a small clearing halfway down the incline, Marcus finally saw it all. Kyle Scott was alive, pressed against a sheer rock wall, clutching a heavy branch like a makeshift spear. Encircling him, moving with the patient, menacing grace of hunters who have already won, were 3 enormous wolves. These were no ordinary wolves. They were larger, their coats the color of shadow, and they moved with a coordinated purpose that bespoke an intelligence far beyond mere instinct. Their eyes snared his flashlight beam, flashing back a hungry, emerald green. One let out a growl that seemed to vibrate up from the very soil, and Kyle's desperate swing of the branch met only empty air. The being at Marcus's side emitted a sound. It wasn't a roar, but a low rumble that resonated deep in its chest. Yet, the wolves heard it. As one, all 3 turned their heads toward the ridge, their lips peeling back to reveal teeth that shone like polished bone in his light. The alpha of the pack took a deliberate step toward Marcus, and then another. It was a test, a measurement, a cold calculation to determine if this newcomer was a threat or simply more meat for the hunt. Marcus brought his pistol up. His hands were rock steady now, the fire of adrenaline incinerating his exhaustion and fear. He had put down many animals in his time, always cleanly, always with reason, and always with a solemn respect for the life being taken. He had never taken pleasure in it. He had never wanted it. And he certainly did not want it now. Stay back, he warned the wolves, his voice a low rumble, knowing the words were meaningless, but the feeling behind them was universal. I don't wish to harm you, but I will not hesitate. The alpha wolf paused, its head cocked in what looked like consideration. Its eyes held a depth of thought that unsettled Marcus profoundly. These were not mindless beasts. They were intelligent hunters, operating with a chilling purpose, almost as if they were following orders. Just then, the being beside Marcus stepped forward, positioning itself as a shield between him and the pack. It seemed to grow larger, spreading its limbs, rising to its full, imposing height. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a series of primal sounds that resonated with authority, warning, and an undeniable threat, the ancient language of the forest itself, understood only by those who live beyond civilization's edge. The wolves immediately ceased their advance. The leader tilted its head, listening intently, before offering a lower, submissive sound in return. It was a response, a clear dialogue that Marcus could not comprehend with his ears, but could feel in the very marrow of his bones. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the alpha wolf turned and retreated. The other two followed without a sound. They vanished into the shadows, as if they were ghosts, leaving only their tracks in the frost, and the lingering image of glowing green eyes in the dark. Kyle finally collapsed against a large rock, the branch he was holding falling from a hand that had lost all its strength. Marcus rushed down the slope to him, while his otherworldly guide remained on the ridge, a silent, watchful sentinel. Kyle, are you injured? The younger man looked up, his face a mess of scratches, his jacket torn to ribbons. His eyes were so wide with terror and exhaustion that the whites seemed to swallow the irises. Marcus. How did you? Marcus cut him off with a single word. Later. Can you stand? Can you walk? I think so. My ankle is twisted. But my God, Marcus. Did you see them? Did you see? I saw, Marcus confirmed, pulling Kyle to his feet and taking on the majority of his weight. We have to go, now, before they have a change of heart. They began the arduous journey back toward the ridge, Kyle limping so badly that he nearly brought them both down on 2 separate occasions. The creature reappeared ahead of them, keeping its distance but clearly illuminating their path. The sight of it made Kyle stop dead in his tracks. Oh, dear God, that is. Don't, Marcus commanded, his voice low and firm. Do not stare at it. Do not point. Do not attempt to document it in any way. Your only concern is getting yourself home alive. But it is real. It's actually real. This is everything I was searching for. Everything that almost got you killed. Marcus interrupted sharply. That being up there just saved your life. The least you can do is show it some respect by keeping this to yourself. They climbed the rest of the way in a heavy silence, following their guide through trees that no longer felt threatening, through shadows that now seemed to offer protection. It led them back to Marcus's property via a shorter, steeper route, and they arrived at the cabin just as the first hint of grey dawn began to bleed across the eastern sky. Buster was on the porch, his tail wagging with such force it shook his whole body. He let out a single bark, a sound of pure relief, of joyous greeting for his human's return from whatever darkness had taken him. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing. It looked at Marcus, and Marcus met its gaze. In that silent moment, something profound passed between them, an unspoken agreement, a covenant that felt as solid as a promise, sealing a bond that transcended species, logic, and everything Marcus had ever believed to be true. And then, it was gone. It vanished with a whisper of movement, leaving only empty space where something truly impossible had just been standing. Kyle leaned heavily against the porch railing, his body racked with shivers from the cold and the shock. Marcus unlocked the cabin door, guided him inside, and sat him by the wood stove, where the coals from the night before still held a faint warmth. Can I get you some coffee? Marcus asked, his voice gentle. Whiskey, Kyle rasped. Please, if you have any. Marcus did. It was Linda's bottle, the good stuff she had saved for anniversaries and special occasions that had stopped coming once the illness arrived. He poured 2 fingers worth into a glass and handed it to Kyle. Kyle drank it in one go, gasping as the warmth hit him. He looked at Marcus, his eyes full of 1,000 questions and no clear answers. What in the hell was that out there? I truly don't know. Don't lie to me. You knew where to find me. You communicated with those wolves. And that thing that led us back, you weren't surprised by it. You knew. Marcus poured a smaller amount of whiskey for himself, just enough to cut the chill from his bones. What I know and what I can prove, he said softly, are 2 very different things. I have my notes. I have photos on my camera. If it's not destroyed, I have evidence. Evidence of what? The story is simple. You were lost, and I found you. A few wolves were aggressive, and then they left. That is all that happened. Kyle's gaze was fixed upon him, a storm of disbelief and defiance in his eyes. You can't possibly expect me to. I expect you to deeply consider what happens when you try to prove a truth the world is not prepared for. Marcus sank into the chair opposite him, a sudden, bone-deep weariness making it a struggle to hold his head up. You publish your photographs, write your articles, make grand claims you can't entirely substantiate. Best outcome, you're branded a madman. Worst outcome, they believe you. The scientists arrive. The media circus follows. Hunters come seeking a unique prize. The government will surely get involved. And what do you think becomes of those beings then? Kyle's jaw worked, his hands trembling around the empty glass. I spent 21 days tracking them. 21 days documenting, observing, trying to fathom their existence. They are intelligent, Marcus. They have a language, a social structure. They are a people, just a different kind of people. The scientific community has to know. The world has to know. For what purpose? The question hung in the silence between them, heavy with consequence. Because it changes the very fabric of everything, Kyle finally uttered. Evolution, anthropology, our entire understanding of what it means to be human. It is the single greatest discovery of the century, or it is the end of a people who have survived only by remaining a secret. Marcus refilled Kyle's glass without being asked. You are 28 years old. You have your whole life stretched out before you. But them? Their only defense is their invisibility. If you take that away, you are not discovering them. You are extinguishing them, just more slowly than a bullet would. Kyle stared at the whiskey but did not drink. Outside, the day was now in full bloom, lights spilling across the forest, transforming shadows into solid things of bark and branch and ordinary purpose. The strangeness of the night was dissolving with the darkness, becoming a memory that might later be doubted or dismissed when the whiskey wore off and the stark light of day made everything seem normal again. I need to think, Kyle said, his voice barely a whisper. That is the wisest thing you have said since I found you. Marcus stood, his joints protesting the movement. You can stay here today. Sleep, eat, let your mind settle. Your girlfriend is worried to death. I will call her. Let her know you're safe. Tomorrow, we will figure out the story you are going to tell and who you will tell it to. And if I choose to tell the truth. Marcus looked at him for a long, searching moment. He saw his younger self in the boy so certain of everything, so sure that truth mattered more than any consequence, believing the world operated on principles that could be measured and trusted. Life had beaten that certainty out of him slowly, year by year, loss by loss, until all that was left was the understanding that some things are more precious when protected than they are when discovered. Then I cannot stop you, Marcus said finally. But I will tell you that my wife, Linda, she used to say that truth is like medicine. Sometimes it cures, sometimes it poisons. You have to know which kind you are holding before you administer the dose. He left Kyle by the fire and went to the kitchen to make coffee and call the girlfriend, whose name he couldn't recall, but whose panic he could vividly imagine. Behind him, he heard Kyle crying the quiet, exhausted sobs of a man who had witnessed too much and did not know how to carry the weight of it. Marcus understood that weight. He had been carrying his own version of it for days now. He would probably carry it for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. The coffee brewed, the phone call was made. The girlfriend cried with relief and promised she would be there in less than an hour. Outside, the forest stood silent and ordinary, keeping its secrets as it always had. And somewhere within those trees, beings that should not exist continued their lives, hoping the human world would grant them the peace to survive for another generation. Marcus hoped so, too. But hope was a thin currency in these times, and its value was steadily falling. Kyle slept for most of the day, lost to the world on Marcus's couch, while Buster kept a silent watch from the floor beside him. The girlfriend, Madison, her name was appeared around 10 o'clock, hugged Kyle with a rib-cracking intensity, then unleashed a verbal storm with such fury that Marcus was glad he had stepped outside to grant them their privacy. By noon they were gone, with Madison driving and Kyle in the passenger seat, looking both shell-shocked and deeply pensive. He had promised to consider what Marcus had said, promised not to make any decisions while exhausted and traumatized. Whether he would honor those promises was anyone's guess. Marcus passed the afternoon, mending things that were not broken, keeping his hands occupied so his mind could not wander down paths that led nowhere productive. He reinforced the fence line yet again. He chopped more wood than he would need for a full month. He cleaned the ATV's engine until it gleamed. As sunset neared, Jake Martinez's truck reappeared on the dirt road. Marcus watched it approach, wiping grease from his hands and preparing for a conversation he had no desire to have. Jake climbed out more slowly this time, moving like a man who had spent the day in the woods and was feeling every year of his age. "Found Kyle," he said without any preamble. "His girlfriend called me, said you brought him back. Found him up north. Ankle was twisted. He was disoriented. He'll be fine." What was he doing all the way up there? Being young and foolish. The same things we did at that age. Jake studied him with eyes that had seen enough liars to recognize the truth even when it wore a disguise. "Did he tell you what he was looking for?" "He told me many things. Most of them didn't make a lick of sense, but some of them did." Marcus did not answer. He did not need to. The silence spoke volumes. From the depths of his jacket pocket, Jake produced a creased piece of paper, extending it toward him. "This was pinned up at the ranger station this morning. I figured it was something you needed to see." Marcus carefully unfolded the paper, revealing a professionally printed flyer. Bold letters at the top proclaimed a cryptozoological expedition seeking evidence of Sasquatch in Cascade Range. Beneath the stark heading were photographs of footprint casts, indistinct images that could have been any number of things, and quotes from individuals attesting to their own sightings. At the very bottom was the contact information for a Dr. Ryan Walker from the University of Portland's Department of Anthropology. "He's made his way up here 3 times in the past month alone," Jake explained. "He's interviewing witnesses, collecting samples, even setting up trail cameras. The man is thorough and dangerously serious. The kind of serious that draws unwanted eyes." A cold dread settled in Marcus's gut. When is he scheduled to return? The posted date indicates he'll be back next weekend. He's bringing students this time, planning a week-long survey of the entire area. Jake retrieved the flyer, folding it with deliberate care. "You see, Marcus, I've spent my entire life in these woods. I've never encountered anything that couldn't be rationally explained. But recently, I'm not so certain. And if there truly is something out there, something living, an academic expedition, armed with cameras, documentation, and the scrutiny of peer review, that kind of discovery won't simply fade away. What is it you expect me to say, Jake? I need you to tell me if this is something I should be concerned about, if I ought to be warning folks to avoid certain parts of the forest, if there's a genuine danger out there, and who, exactly, would it be dangerous to? To anyone who crosses its path, to itself, to the delicate balance we have here." Jake's voice was low, laden with a weight that felt like regret. "I'm a hunter, Marcus, you know that. These woods are my livelihood. But I'm not a fool, and I'm not a cruel man. If something exists out there that requires protection, I have to know. Because this Dr. Walker, he isn't going to just give up. And if he discovers what he's searching for, we both know what will follow." Marcus's mind filled with images. The mother creature cradling her injured young, the silent guide that had led him to Kyle through the oppressive dark, the smooth stone on his mantelpiece. Its ancient symbols, a familiar comfort, he traced each morning as his coffee brewed. They are not dangerous. The words seem to come from him unbidden, not unless they are threatened. All they want is to be left in peace. Jake gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if Marcus had just given voice to a suspicion he had long held. "How many of them are there?" "I can't say for certain. A family unit, perhaps. There could be more, or they could be the only ones." "And what about Kyle? He ventured too close and became frightened. They simply scared him away, leaving him unharmed. They could have easily ended his life, but they chose not to. Doesn't that tell you something? It tells me they possess more restraint than most humans would in a similar circumstance." Jake's gaze drifted to the tree line, where the shadows were deepening with the fading light. "You understand that I have to report this. I'm obligated to inform the authorities that there's something out here people should be cautious of. Are you truly obligated? And what's the alternative? Remain silent and hope no one gets hurt. Hope this professor finds nothing. Hope the entire situation simply vanishes?" Jake shook his head, a weary gesture. "I'm 60 years old, Marcus. I don't have the energy for wishful thinking anymore. I'm just trying to cause the least amount of harm." They stood together in a heavy silence, as the last of the light bled from the sky and the evening chill set in. Somewhere deep in the forest, beings that were not supposed to exist readied themselves for another night of survival in a world that demanded proof of their reality. "Grant me 1 week," Marcus said at last, "before you file any reports. Just 1 week to see if another path can be found. And what other path could there possibly be? I don't know yet, but if you make this official, it's all over. Game wardens, the Forest Service, the media, it will become a circus. Give me 1 week to find a solution that doesn't end with them being hunted down or put in a cage." Jake mulled this over for a long moment before giving a slow nod. 1 week. After that, I have to do what my conscience dictates. That's fair enough. Jake climbed back into his truck and turned the key in the ignition. Before pulling away, he leaned out the open window. "Marcus, whatever it is you're considering, be careful. Good intentions are no guarantee against tragic outcomes." The truck vanished down the dirt road, its taillights swallowed by the gloom, leaving Marcus alone with the encroaching night and a dilemma that offered no easy solutions. There were only varying degrees of terrible and the faint hope that a path existed that did not lead to tragedy. He retreated inside, bolting the door behind him, and settled into the chair at Linda's old desk, tucked in the corner by the window. It was where she had once paid bills and composed letters, back in an era when people still put pen to paper. Now, it was a repository for dust, memories, and a laptop Marcus was only vaguely familiar with. He powered on the machine, waiting for it to come to life with the practiced patience of a man who had come to technology late in life and never fully trusted its whims. Then, he began his research on Dr. Ryan Walker. The university's website loaded with agonizing slowness. Marcus navigated through the pages until he located the faculty directory and, within it, Walker's profile. He was a man in his mid-40s, a tenure-track professor, specializing in evolutionary anthropology and the controversial field of cryptozoology. His curriculum vitae listed publications in obscure journals and presentations at conferences on subjects that would have seemed utterly absurd if not for the proof Marcus had witnessed with his own eyes. A photograph accompanied the profile. Walker appeared younger than his 45 years, with an eager face, wire-rimmed glasses, and a smile that conveyed an unshakable belief in his work, regardless of what others might think. His listed research interests included undocumented hominid species and indigenous oral traditions regarding cryptid encounters. He had authored 3 books, none from major publishing houses, all dedicated to exploring a single, profound question. What if the legends were true? Marcus located Walker's university email and simply stared, the cursor blinking like a tiny, insistent heartbeat. This was an error in judgment. It had to be. To engage was to invite scrutiny, to bring peril to the very beings he had silently vowed to shield. Yet, inaction meant allowing an expedition to blindly wander into a world they couldn't comprehend, armed with technology that would capture every secret, and guided by students who would splash their findings across the digital world before the next sunrise. His fingers moved across the keyboard, then he erased the words. He tried once more, and again, the message vanished. Finally, on his 3rd attempt, he crafted something that resonated with a measure of truth, yet kept the deepest secrets veiled. "Dr. Walker, I am Marcus Thompson, a retired wildlife officer residing in the Cascade Range near Bend, Oregon. I have come to understand that you are organizing an expedition into this region. I possess knowledge that could be of significant relevance to your research. Should you be amenable to a private meeting prior to your official journey, I am confident it would prove to be a valuable use of your time. Marcus Thompson." He appended his phone number and pressed send before his own doubts could sabotage the act, leaning back with the distinct sensation that he had just ignited a very long fuse, with no idea how long it had to burn. Outside, the last light had been swallowed by a profound darkness. The air grew teeth as the temperature plunged, likely into the low teens, a cold so sharp that any exposed skin would cry out in minutes. Marcus prepared a meal he couldn't taste and fed Buster, who ate with a similar lack of spirit, before settling by the wood stove to watch the flames devour the logs as his own mind devoured every possible outcome. At around 8 in the evening, his telephone chimed. The number was unfamiliar. A part of Marcus wanted to let it ring, but a potent mixture of curiosity and apprehension compelled him to answer. "Is this Marcus Thompson?" The voice was male, articulate, and humming with excitement. My name is Ryan Walker. I received your email. I must admit, you have my complete attention. That was quick. I become obsessive about my email when I'm arranging fieldwork. Walker's laugh was genuine, the sound of a man who drew true happiness from his profession. Your message was purposefully ambiguous. What sort of information are we discussing? Marcus selected his words with the care of a man disarming a trap, the sort that could reshape your entire approach, that could make your expedition safer and far more profound. You've witnessed something. It was a statement, not a question. Walker understood the cadence of these calls. He had likely fielded hundreds from individuals, claiming to have seen the impossible, offering flimsy proof, desperate to be believed. Most were mistaken or seeking the spotlight, but his tone suggested that every so often, one of them was speaking the unvarnished truth. I might have, Marcus conceded. It's difficult to be certain. But if I have, and you come crashing through these forests with students and lenses and no inkling of what you're truly facing, people could be harmed. And the very things you seek could be harmed as well. I would prefer to prevent that outcome. A beat of silence stretched across the line. Then, you are their guardian. I am everyone's guardian. That includes your students, who likely view this as a thrilling escapade, oblivious to the fact they could be stepping into depths they cannot possibly navigate. What is it you require of me, Mr. Thompson? A meeting. Tomorrow, if it's possible. Just you. No entourage, no cameras, no recording equipment of any kind. I will share what I know. Afterward, you can determine your own course. And if I decline? If I proceed with my expedition as scheduled, then you will. I am not in a position to halt you. But you will be entering that wilderness without sight, and in the backcountry, it's what you don't see that ensures you are never seen again. More silence. Marcus could practically hear the gears turning in Walker's mind, calculating the risk versus the potential discovery, balancing academic caution against raw curiosity. At last, there is a diner in Bend. It's called the Pancake Mill. Are you familiar with it? I am. I can be there by noon tomorrow. But I want to be clear, Mr. Thompson. If this is some elaborate hoax or an attempt to frighten me away from legitimate research, please know I have faced far more than distrustful locals. I am not a man who is easily deterred. I have no intention of deterring you, Dr. Walker. My intention is to enlighten you. There is a profound difference. We shall see. Noon tomorrow. I will be the one in a University of Portland jacket. The connection ended. Marcus placed the phone on the table and gazed into the fire, wondering if he had just steered things toward a better path, or a worse one. He questioned if better even existed anymore, or if all that remained were varying shades of tragedy, with no truly good choices left on the board. Buster let out a low whine from his post near the door. The old dog's gaze was fixed on the window, his ears erect, his entire body a wire of tension. Marcus moved to the glass and saw nothing but darkness at first. Then, a flicker of motion snagged his eye, a shape flowing between the trees at the boundary of his land, present and then gone so swiftly it could have been a trick of the light. But Buster's quiet growl confirmed it was no illusion. Something was out there in the cold dark, observing, waiting. Perhaps the hidden ones knew what was approaching. Perhaps they could feel the shift in the world's currents, the gathering tempest of human curiosity that was poised to break upon their secret existence. Marcus drew the heavy curtains shut, fed another log to the dying fire, and attempted to assure himself that he was doing the only thing he could, that a meeting with Walker was the least damaging path in a maze with no safe exit, that this could all somehow conclude without sorrow, without loss that would echo down through the ages. But the stark reality was that he did not know. He could not possibly know. He was simply a man making his best guess with a handful of truths, and praying that mercy would find them in the end. He drifted to sleep in Linda's old armchair as the fire faded to embers, and he dreamed of silent figures running through a forest of flames, fleeing from men with cold steel and cameras, driven by the absolute conviction that the act of discovery was more sacred than the act of survival. He rose with the dawn, a heavy certainty settling in his gut that today was a tipping point he wasn't ready to face. The Pancake Mill was the epitome of places Marcus actively loathed, a chaotic symphony of noise, tourists, and families that left his head throbbing. But its public, neutral ground made it the ideal stage for a meeting that needed the safety of witnesses without the intrusion of an audience. Showing up a full 15 minutes early, he secured a booth in the rear corner with a clear line of sight to the door and ordered a coffee. The waitress, likely in her early 20s, possessed a bright-eyed optimism that suggested the world hadn't worn her down yet. Marcus felt a sharp pang of envy for that innocence. Ryan Walker appeared precisely at high noon, his eyes sweeping the diner with the methodical gaze of a man who lived by observation. He was shorter than Marcus had envisioned, maybe 5'8", with the lean, wiry build of someone more at home on a trail than behind a desk. His bright green University of Portland jacket was impossible to miss. He spotted Marcus, crossed the room, and slid into the booths with the easy confidence of a person accustomed to being welcomed. "Mr. Thompson," he offered his hand. "I appreciate you making the time." Marcus took it. The grip was firm, the palm calloused in a way that spoke of genuine fieldwork, not just directing students. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Walker ordered his own coffee, waited for the waitress to be out of earshot, and then leaned forward, his excitement barely contained. "So, tell me everything you've witnessed." "First, you tell me why," Marcus countered. "Why pour your career into chasing what most of the world writes off as a fairy tale?" Walker offered a small smile. "Because folklore is often just history we haven't verified yet. Because countless indigenous cultures worldwide tell stories of such beings different names, but the descriptions are uncannily similar. It's too consistent to be a coincidence. And because..." He paused, as if deciding how much truth to reveal. "Because when I was 12 years old, camping in the Olympics with my father, I saw something watching us from the trees. Something impossible, that shouldn't exist by any textbook's definition. My father wrote it off as a bear, or my imagination. But I know what I saw. I've spent my entire life since then trying to prove I wasn't crazy." Marcus recognized that drive intimately the burning need to validate your own reality, to prove the world is far wilder than the experts admit. And if you do prove it, what then? Then we revolutionize our understanding of human evolution. We get to document a sister species that survived by mastering habitats we considered uninhabitable for hominids. We learn how they've remained ghosts for so long. It is the single greatest scientific discovery of our time, Mr. Thompson. Or it's the final chapter for a species that has only survived by remaining a secret. The blaze in Walker's eyes cooled a few degrees. "You believe that documenting them would guarantee their extinction?" "I think humanity has a poor track record with mysteries. We capture them, dissect them, and study them until the wonder is gone. And creatures like this," Marcus chose his words with care, "creatures that live in the twilight between the known and the unknown. They need that twilight to breathe. You shine a spotlight into it, and you destroy the only world they've ever had. So you have seen them." Walker's voice was now a quiet, intense whisper. "This isn't just a hypothetical discussion for you." Marcus pulled out his phone, swiping to the photos he had taken in the aftermath of the rescue. He showed him close-ups of the carved stone, the makeshift bandages stained with a blood type that was neither human nor animal, a solitary, perfect footprint he had managed to photograph before the sun melted the delicate frost that held its form. Walker examined each image with the forensic precision of a man trained to debunk hoaxes. When he handed the phone back, his hands were trembling slightly. "These are my God. These are authentic. They're authentic. They're also everything you will ever get from me. No coordinates, no further evidence. And I will absolutely not lead you, or anyone else, to them." "But you could," Walker insisted, his voice tight with desperation. "You know where they are. I know where they were. There's a difference." Marcus drained his coffee, wishing it were whiskey. "This is what I'm offering you, Dr. Walker. I will share information that might help you comprehend what you're truly dealing with. In exchange, you rethink your entire approach, a smaller team, stricter precautions. You focus on collecting trace evidence, not on forcing a direct observation. You're asking me to cripple my own research. I'm asking you to conduct it without getting your students killed, without getting these beings harmed, without triggering a chain of events that brings hunters, media, and government agencies swarming these mountains and turning their home into a sideshow." A long silence stretched between them. Outside the diner's windows, the town of Bend continued its day, a world of mundane errands and ordinary life. Inside, two men sat in a booth, debating how to protect a miracle the world didn't even believe in. "Tell me about them," Walker finally conceded. "Not where, not how many, just. What are they like? What have you observed?" So Marcus told him, his words measured and deliberate, carefully omitting any detail that could betray a location or a family unit. He spoke of their intelligence, their use of tools, their complex language, their powerful social bonds, and an emotional capacity that felt deeply human, yet was something entirely other. He described how they communicated, how they protected their young, and how they had, for one brief, desperate moment, chosen to trust him enough to ask for help. Walker listened, rapt and unmoving, his academic mind filing away every word. When Marcus finished, the professor leaned back, his expression a mixture of profound awe and deep, aching grief. "They're a people," Walker said, his voice barely a whisper. "A different kind, but a people, not animals. That's what I believe. But believing it and proving it are two very different things. And proving it means exposing them to the world. There might be a third option." Walker pulled out a notebook and began to sketch. "What if we reframe the entire project? We don't try to document them directly. We document the ecosystem that proves they exist. We track their food sources, map their territorial markers, chart their migration patterns. We can build a complete, undeniable picture of their existence without ever taking a single photograph of them. We prove they're real through the shadow they cast on the world. That shadow is still proof," Marcus countered. "And proof always draws a crowd. But this is evidence that honors their seclusion, that acknowledges their fundamental right to remain unseen. We could publish our findings without revealing locations, championing the cause for habitat protection without resorting to exploitation." Walker's voice gained momentum, his earlier excitement returning, now tempered by a profound reverence. "This approach has never been taken because researchers either find nothing or they uncover frauds. But imagine if someone credible, a retired wildlife officer with 4 decades of experience, could verify the indirect signs. That alone could be enough." Marcus mulled this over. It was far from a perfect solution. Nothing about this entire affair was. Yet, it was infinitely better than a full-blown expedition with cameras and students who would plaster their discoveries all over social media before they could grasp the consequences of their actions. So, what would this look like in practice? I return next week as scheduled, but instead of a large team, it would be a minimal footprint, just myself and perhaps one graduate student I implicitly trust. Our focus would be on a habitat survey, flora, scat analysis, territorial markings. You would be our consultant, guiding us on where not to tread, helping us decipher the meaning of what we find. We would publish with the utmost care, with your full review, prioritizing conservation above all else. And what if they are seen regardless? What happens if your student manages to capture a photograph? Then we will confront that reality if and when it occurs. But we will proceed with the clear and unwavering intention of respecting their boundaries, of treating them as a protected people, even if they lack that official designation for now. It was a compromise. But this whole situation was a tapestry of compromises. Marcus's mind drifted to the mother and her young, to the being that had guided him to Kyle, to the carved stone upon his mantle, a symbol of trust extended across a chasm that should have been unbridgeable, yet somehow was. "You have 1 week to prepare," Marcus stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I will designate safe zones for your survey, areas where you'll find your evidence without direct encounters. You will agree to run every single finding by me before it sees the light of day. And if I say it's over, it's over. No debate." Walker reached out his hand once more. "We have an agreement." They sealed the pact with a handshake, 2 men forging a covenant to shield a mystery neither could fully comprehend, gambling that their honorable intentions would be enough to see it through. Marcus drove home with a cold knot of anxiety tightening in his gut. He had just consented to help chronicle the existence of beings he had sworn to protect, rationalizing it as a form of harm reduction, the selection of a lesser evil in a world that offered no truly good options. But Linda's voice echoed in his memory, her timeless warning whenever he tried to justify a morally grey choice. "The road to damnation is paved with good intentions, Marcus. Make sure you're watching where you're stepping." He pulled into his familiar parking spot, emerging from the truck stiffly, his body aching from the long drive. Buster greeted him at the door, tail a blur of joyous motion, content that his human was home. Some things in life were beautifully simple. The loyalty of a dog, the comfort of a well-worn routine. Those were the things Marcus understood. Everything else was spiraling into greater complexity by the hour, and he had just 1 week to learn how to navigate the razor's edge between protection and betrayal, between being their savior and becoming their Judas. He dedicated the afternoon to creating maps. It was an old instinct from his days as a wildlife officer: document everything, chart territories, observe patterns. These maps, however, were different. They were guides to illusion, not discovery, safe zones, where Walker could gather evidence without intrusion, buffer zones, where human presence was to be kept to an absolute minimum, and the red zones, sacred grounds he would sooner die than surrender, for those were the places where families dwelled, where the young ones played, and where mothers stood eternal watch. As he worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to that frost-covered morning, to the act of dressing wounds and making impossible choices, to the instant a colossal being had looked into his soul and chosen trust over instinctual fear. That single moment had shifted something fundamental within him, branding him with a responsibility he could not fully articulate, but felt deep in his bones. The phone shattered the quiet around 5 o'clock. Marcus nearly ignored it, figuring it was Walker with another round of questions. But the number was from the local area. "Marcus? This is Madison, Kyle's girlfriend. How is he doing? That's the reason I'm calling." Her voice was strained, topped with worry. "He's vanished again. He left this morning when I was at my job. He took all his gear, his car, everything. There was a note. It said he was sorry but he had to do this, that he had to document what he saw. He said it was too significant to remain a secret." A chill of dread washed over Marcus. Did the note say where he was headed? No, but I found his research papers. He'd circled locations on a map, places he theorized they might be. She hesitated. "Marcus, what is truly out there? Kyle refuses to tell me, says I would never believe him. But he hasn't been the same since you brought him home. He's terrified but also obsessed, as if he witnessed something that rewired his entire world." He did. There was no sense in denying it now. But for him to go back there alone, it's the most dangerous thing he could possibly do. They showed him tolerance once. A second time is not guaranteed. "Can you find him, please? I have a terrible feeling something is going to happen to him." Marcus's gaze fell upon his maps, on the safe zones and buffer zones, and the sacred red zones marked in permanent ink. Tracing the likely paths, Kyle might take the very places a 28-year-old fueled by more passion than wisdom would go in his hunt for proof. "I'll do my best," he said, his voice grave. "But Madison, if I can't reach him in time, you have to start preparing yourself for that outcome. Please don't say that." "I have to, because the thing Kyle is searching for. It is very real, it is very protective, and the wilderness has no regard for his good intentions." He ended the call before she could plead further, grabbing his own gear and stepping out into the late afternoon glow that was already beginning to surrender to dusk. Winter days were fleeting this far north, and they were even shorter in the mountains, where the sun dipped early and the biting cold descended without warning. Buster whined and moved to follow, but Marcus gave a firm command for him to stay. The old dog's strength wouldn't hold out where he was going, and it was better to leave him in safety than to risk them both in the unforgiving terrain. The ATV engine caught with a single, reassuring roar. Marcus aimed it north, tracing the path Kyle would most likely have taken from the maps, Madison recalled. The boy was systematic, meticulously tracking them, charting their patterns, crafting a complete profile of their domain. Clever, precise, the exact kind of thinking that would walk him straight into a nightmare. Marcus pushed the ATV faster than was safe, in a desperate race against the setting sun, against youthful foolishness, and against the fallout of his own misplaced mercy. Had he just left them to their fate in that fence, none of this would be unfolding. Kyle would be home. The creatures would remain a secret. Life would be simple. Yet, Linda's voice whispered back from memory. "Simple and right are two very different things, Marcus. You've always known that." He arrived at the spot where he'd last found Kyle at about 6 in the evening. The light was bleeding from the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows between the ancient trees. Marcus cut the engine, silencing the machine to listen. The whisper of wind through the pines, the far-off calls of birds settling in, the mundane symphony of a forest bedding down for the night. And then he caught it, a sound, faint but unmistakable, someone calling out, their voice a fragile thing, cracked with a strange cocktail of terror and exhilaration. "Here, over here. I only want to see you. I promise I won't hurt you." It was Kyle. The damn kid was trying to coax them out as if they were nothing more than timid woodland pets. Marcus advanced toward the sound, moving with a swift but silent grace, his rifle held at the ready. Not for use, just for the weight of it. All around him, the forest's ambient noise had evaporated. That unnatural silence he'd come to recognize as a silent alarm. Something was watching. Something was very, very close. He discovered Kyle in a clearing approximately 50 yards to the north. The young man had established a base of operations, a tripod, a long-range lens, motion-activated sensors. He stood at the center of his technological web, hands raised, speaking to the trees as if trying to reason with phantoms. "Kyle," Marcus's voice was a harsh crack in the stillness. "Pack your gear. We are leaving, right now." Kyle whipped around, startled. "Marcus, what are you know?" "Absolutely not. I'm not going anywhere. They're here. I can feel their presence. I just need to. You need to be gone before they conclude that you're an intruder." "I'm not an intruder. I'm here to document them, to show the world that they're real. They deserve to be recognized, to be protected. They deserve to be left in peace." Marcus stepped fully into the clearing, his own eyes sweeping the dark tree line. The feeling of being watched was a physical pressure now, multiple sets of eyes. They were being hemmed in. "They are here, Kyle, all around us, and you are terrifying them." "I'm not. I would never." A sound sliced through his denial. A deep, resonant growl that vibrated from the woods to the east. It was answered by a second from the west, and a third from the north. They were completely encircled. 3, maybe 4 of them. More than Marcus could ever hope to fend off, if diplomacy failed. The color drained from Kyle's face. "Oh my God. Oh my God. They're real. They're actually." "Be quiet, and do not move a muscle." Marcus lowered his rifle to the ground with slow, deliberate care. He raised both hands, palms open and empty. Then he performed an action he'd only ever witnessed in old films of indigenous trackers. He touched his heart, then his forehead, and then gestured to the surrounding forest. A sign, an offering, a plea for peace. The growling ceased. The silence that fell was so absolute, so profound, that Marcus could hear the frantic drumming of his own heart. Then, from the eastern shadows, she stepped into the fading light. The matriarch, immense, majestic. Her eyes locked onto Marcus with an intensity that begged him to look away, but he held her gaze, keeping his own steady, projecting calm even as his veins ran with ice. She took a single, deliberate step forward, and another. Behind her, Marcus saw fleeting shapes of the others. 3, 4, perhaps even 5. They had come as a family. Not to hunt, to defend. The matriarch halted 10 feet from him, so close that Marcus could smell the wild, earthy musk of her fur, could see the profound intelligence glowing in her eyes like embers. She studied him, and in that gaze, he saw it. Recognition, memory. She knew who he was. She remembered that he had saved her young. Her gaze then shifted to Kyle, and her entire demeanor transformed. It hardened. The young man was still frozen in place, his sophisticated camera equipment littering the ground around him like the tools of a poacher. She saw him for what he was, what he had come for, not to help, but to capture, to expose. She let out a low, guttural sound, a clear warning. The others shifted, moving in to form a tight semicircle that sealed the 2 humans within the clearing. Marcus felt the crushing weight of the moment. One single misstep would be their end. Kyle would perish for his inability to let a mystery be, and Marcus would perish trying to save him, because that's what he did now. That's the man he had become since Linda was gone, the man who fixed broken things. "Kyle," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "Your camera, take it apart." "What?" "No, I can't. Take it apart, now, or this clearing becomes our grave." Kyle stared at the matriarch, at the silent circle of giants hemming them in, at the twilight that was rapidly bleeding into impenetrable darkness. The reality of his situation finally shattered his scientific excitement. His hands trembled violently as he reached for the camera. He fumbled with the clasps, and he dropped it. The matriarch moved, a blur of impossible speed. She crossed the remaining distance in an instant, snatching the camera from the ground before Kyle could, and with a single fluid motion, she crushed it in her massive hand. Plastic, glass, and intricate electronics imploded like a paper cup. She let the ruined device fall at Kyle's feet. Then she looked back at Marcus. She gestured at Kyle. She made a sound that was not a sound at all. but a perfectly clear question. What is to be done with this one? He brings the threat of discovery. He brings the outside world. Why should I not eliminate this danger here and now? Marcus understood he had one opportunity, one chance to offer an answer that mattered. He took a step, placing himself between the matriarch and Kyle, fully aware it was a suicidal gesture, but doing it anyway, because some lines you simply had to draw. He didn't understand, Marcus murmured, his voice a low plea, knowing she wouldn't grasp the words, but praying the tone would convey his intent. He is young, foolish, but not malicious. He is not a threat. I will ensure he leaves. I swear to you, he will never come back. Please. The matriarch inclined her great head, her gaze fixed on him in silent consideration. Behind her, the others shifted, a restless energy rippling through them as they awaited her verdict. This was the law of the clan, her decision, her family, her domain. She extended one enormous hand. Marcus willed himself to remain still as it drifted toward him. Her fingers brushed against his chest, precisely where he had gestured moments before. Then she touched her own. A mirror image, a silent acknowledgement. Asterisk. You see, you are not like this other one. Asterisk. With that, she turned and strode back toward the sanctuary of the trees. The others followed suit, melting into the shadows that welcomed them as their own. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving behind only shattered camera gear and two humans who had just received a mercy they hadn't earned. Kyle's strength gave out completely. He dropped to his knees in the bed of pine needles, his body shaking so violently that his teeth chattered. She could have destroyed us. Yes, she could have. Then, why didn't she? Because I asked her not to. Because she remembered that I helped her young ones, and because she possesses an intelligence you have yet to comprehend. Marcus seized Kyle's arm, hauling him back to his feet. Now, collect your garbage and get out of my woods. And Kyle, if you ever set foot here again, if you ever dare to try this again, I will not be here to help you. And neither will they. Is that understood? Kyle could only nod, tears streaming down his face not from any physical pain, but from the crushing weight of a new understanding. He had just witnessed something so far beyond his comprehension that his entire worldview had shattered like the lens of his camera. They made their way back to the ATV through the oppressive darkness, Kyle stumbling, Marcus guiding him with a firm hand. The forest felt transformed. It was no longer menacing, but ancient and profoundly indifferent, a quiet reminder that humans were merely visitors here, tolerated, but never in control. Marcus drove Kyle to his car and watched him speed away, feeling the profound relief that comes from narrowly averting disaster. He then sat on his ATV in the enveloping darkness, letting the adrenaline subside, feeling the full weight of his 63 years settle back into his bones. The silence was broken by the ring of his phone. The screen illuminated a single name, Walker. Marcus? Just wanted to confirm, are we still on for next week? No. The word was sharp, final. No, we are not. I've changed my mind. What? But Marcus, we had a deal. The deal is off. I was wrong. There is no way to do this without causing harm. No way to document them without putting them in danger. They have to remain hidden, completely. And I will make absolutely certain that they do. Marcus, just listen to me. He ended the call and powered off the phone. He started the ATV and headed for home, moving through a darkness that now felt like a shield, far less threatening than the harsh glare of discovery would have been. Some secrets, he now knew, were meant to be kept. Some evidence was meant to be buried. Some truths were meant to live in the shadows, for that is the only place they could truly survive. For 40 years, Marcus Thompson had lived by the code of evidence, documentation, and the scientific method. But Linda had been right about one thing, perhaps the most important thing of all. The world was filled with things that defied logic, but held immense meaning. And protecting them was far more important than proving they exist. He arrived home to find Buster waiting on the porch, a pillar of steadfast loyalty. The dog pressed against his legs, offering a silent comfort that asked no questions. Good dogs never cared why you were late, or where you had been, or what you had seen that made your hands shake. They just stayed. Marcus fed the dog, then himself, and sat by the wood stove. He watched the flames consume the logs, while his mind was consumed by the memory of the matriarch's eyes. The intelligence in them, the judgment, the mercy that was born not from weakness, but from a strength so profound it needed no proof. He picked up the carved stone from the mantel, tracing its cryptic symbols with his calloused fingers. Whatever their true meaning, they felt like a covenant, a promise, a sacred pact between species that transcended language, law, and everything else upon which human civilization was built. The phone began to ring again, and again, and again. It was likely Walker, or perhaps Madison checking on Kyle, or Jake. With more questions Marcus could no longer honestly answer. He let it ring, he let the messages accumulate. He let the world clamor for what it wanted, refusing to feed its endless hunger. Tomorrow, he would face the consequences, but tonight, he would just sit here in Linda's chair, holding a stone given to him by an impossible being, and let himself believe that he had done the right thing, even if he could never prove it. Outside, the forest stood in silent, dark majesty. Nothing moved, no sound was made. There were only the trees and the stars, and the secrets they would keep for as long as men like Marcus chose protection over discovery. He fell asleep right there, as the fire burned low, the stone growing warm in his hand, and he dreamed of nothing at all. When he awoke, the morning had arrived with a gentle quiet. Snow was falling, the first real snow of the season, its fat flakes drifting down with a lazy softness. Marcus made coffee and stood at the window, watching his property vanish under a blanket of white. By noon, every track would be covered, every print erased. The land would be made clean and new, as unmarked as the day he had first bought it. He considered calling Walker back, trying to explain. But what could he possibly say? How do you tell a man that his life's work must remain unfinished? That some questions are better left unanswered? That discovery is not always progress? The carved stone sat on the windowsill, catching the angles of the morning light. Marcus picked it up, feeling its weight, its undeniable reality. This was all the proof he would ever need. For him, if for no one else. It was evidence that would never hold up in a court of law, that would never satisfy the scientific community, that would never change a single textbook. But it was evidence nonetheless. It was personal, it was private, and it was undeniably real. 15 missed calls glowed on his phone's screen. Marcus erased them all, unheard. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee, letting the silent dance of falling snow and the quiet of the cabin reclaim his world. A world he was content to let spin on without him. A knock echoed through the cabin sometime mid-morning. Instinctively, Marcus tensed, his hand drifting toward the pistol he now kept within reach. But Buster's tail thumped a happy rhythm against the floorboards. The dog's judgment of character was far more reliable than his own. He opened the door to a woman in her 70s, a figure etched against the snow-covered porch. Her heavy coat and well-worn boots spoke of decades of harsh winters, and her face was a map of survival, weathered by the same wind and time that had shaped his own. There was a flicker of familiarity about her, yet he couldn't quite place the memory. Her voice was steady as she spoke his name. Marcus Thompson, he affirmed with a cautious nod. That's right. My name is Sarah Miller, she stated plainly. I live about 20 miles to the west, and I believe it's time we had a conversation. He stepped aside, granting her entry based on 2 facts: Buster's immediate approval and a profound understanding in her eyes that spoke of secrets kept. She accepted his offer of coffee, taking a seat at his kitchen table, her gaze sweeping the room as if she were reading the cabin's very soul. Jake Martinez paid me a visit yesterday, she began, breaking the silence. He mentioned you've had some unusual encounters. Wondered if I might know something useful. A faint smile touched her lips. Jake and I have a long history. He knows I've witnessed my share of the unexplained. He sent me here, thinking I could offer some guidance. Marcus's reply was laced with skepticism. Guidance? With what, exactly? With coming to terms with the reality you've stumbled into, and with learning how to safeguard something this world is not prepared to acknowledge. She reached into her pocket and produced a photograph, placing it on the table. It was old, faded, the back stamped with the year 1973. The image showed a much younger Sarah beside a colossal, dark-furred figure. Though its face was turned from the lens, its immense size and familiar silhouette were undeniable. Marcus's gaze shifted from the worn photograph to the old woman's face, a single, stunned word escaping him. How? The same way you did, she answered softly. I found one that was hurt. I offered it aid, and they remembered. They've trusted me ever since. She carefully tucked the photo back into her pocket, That was 40 years ago. I've been the keeper of their secret all this time. Misdirecting hunters, misleading researchers, turning the merely curious down the wrong path. It was the only way I knew to protect them. A flash of resentment crossed his face. You could have warned me. Before all of this chaos. Before Kyle and Walker, I had no idea you existed until Jake's call. By that point, the wheels were already turning. She took a slow sip of her coffee. But I'm here now, and I can share the wisdom I've gathered over 40 years as their guardian. He echoed the title, letting the weight of the word settle. Their guardian, that is precisely what we are, Marcus. A role we didn't ask for, but one we've inherited. We witnessed them, we helped them, and in turn, they placed their trust in us. That trust comes with a profound responsibility. It makes us an integral part of their survival. She placed her cup on the table. There are others like us, not a great many, sprinkled throughout the Cascades, the Olympics, the Rockies, people who've had their own encounters, who chose protection over exposure. We have our own quiet ways of communicating, of helping one another, of keeping the secret safe. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a tightness in his chest begin to ease. He was not alone. He wasn't the only one burdened by this impossible truth. How many of them are out there? He asked. The creatures? Our best guess. Perhaps 50. Possibly fewer. Their numbers are dangerously low, scattered in small family groups. They're just trying to exist in a world that shrinks around them every single year. Urban sprawl, a changing climate, our own relentless expansion. It all conspires against them. We, their guardians, may be the only thing standing between them and extinction. He looked at her, his expression serious. So what is it you need from me? The same thing I ask of all who become part of this. Constant vigilance, absolute discretion, the strength to tell a convincing lie when you must, and to hold your tongue when every instinct screams to talk. Men like Kyle Scott and Ryan Walker, they are not the first to come searching, and I assure you, they won't be the last. You must be prepared for what's coming. Marcus's thoughts immediately went to the professor. Walker's expedition, already taken care of, Sarah said, and this time her smile was sharp, almost predatory. I made a call to the university, posing as a concerned citizen, planted a few seeds of doubt about his research ethics, gently suggested a thorough review of his proposals before greenlighting any fieldwork. He'll be drowning in bureaucratic red tape for months. By the time he gets approval, if he ever does this trail, will have gone ice cold. A genuine laugh escaped Marcus. He couldn't stop it. This 70-something woman, who could pass for anyone's grandmother, had just effortlessly sunk a professor's entire research project with nothing more than a few phone calls and a deep understanding of red tape. You're a dangerous woman, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. I'm effective, she corrected him. There is a significant difference. She stood and finished the last of her coffee. I will email you a list containing the other guardians, along with contact details and code words to verify their identities. We support one another, share intelligence, and coordinate our efforts. Welcome to the network, Marcus. Your membership began the moment you chose to help. He challenged her, his voice low, and what if I don't want to be a part of it? Sarah met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw the immense weight of 4 decades of secrets, 4 decades of choosing the difficult, righteous path over the simple, wrong one. Then you are free to walk away, she said. You can forget everything you've seen. Tell yourself it was just stress, or grief, or a trick of the mind. Many people choose that path, but I don't believe you're one of them. I believe Linda raised a better man than that. Marcus's head shot up at the mention of her name. How do you know about Linda? Jake told me, she explained. He told me you've been on your own for 3 years. He said you are the type of man who can't help but save things, no matter the personal cost. She walked toward the door. That is precisely why you are suited for this. You know the sting of loss. You understand what it feels like to watch something precious disappear, and you possess the stubborn will to fight, to prevent it from happening again. Before Marcus could form a reply, she was gone. All that remained were her boot prints in the fresh snow, already vanishing under a new layer of falling flakes. He remained in the open doorway, the cold air washing over him as he watched her truck fade into the wintry landscape. Buster nudged his hand, a silent, knowing gesture from the old dog that said there was no sense in freezing out here when warmth and shelter were just steps away. Marcus stepped inside, closing the door on the cold, and returned to the stone resting on the windowsill. He lifted it once more, feeling its heft, its latent warmth, and the unspoken covenant it represented. A guardian. The word Sarah had used resonated with him. Not a mere witness, nor just a protector, but a guardian one who stands as a silent sentinel between a secret world and the one that would destroy it, bearing the full weight of that knowledge alone. His thoughts drifted to Linda. He could almost hear what she'd say if she were here, likely chiding him gently for always shouldering too much, for carrying burdens meant for more than one man. Yet, she would have understood. That was the profound gift of their 35 years together. A deep knowing that required no words, an acceptance that offered no judgment. "So, what's the verdict?" he murmured to her photograph on the mantel. "Have I finally lost my mind? Taking on a duty like this at 63, an age when other men are chasing golf balls and complaining about their knees?" The photograph remained silent, of course, but in the quiet of the room, her voice was as clear as day in his heart. The only crazy thing to do would be to walk away. The only madness would be to pretend you never saw what you did. "You are many things, Marcus Thompson, but a madman isn't one of them." A faint smile touched his lips. He carefully placed the stone beside her picture, letting the two sentinels of his life keep watch together. Outside, the snow descended in a steady, purifying blanket, covering all evidence, smoothing over tracks, and making the world seem pristine and new. Deep within that forest, creatures deemed impossible carried on with their lives. They hunted, they gathered, they raised their young, enduring another day in a world that was always on the verge of discovering them. And Marcus Thompson, 63 years old, a retired officer of the wild, a widower, a man of doubt turned true believer, stood his ground. He guarded them not with firearms or fences, but with his silence, with his vigilance, with the profound understanding that some truths are more vital than any proof. He poured himself another measure of coffee and sat at Linda's old desk. He opened the email from Sarah that had arrived during their call, a cryptic list of names, numbers, and coded phrases that would mean absolutely nothing to an outsider. "Welcome to the network," the message concluded. "We are so glad to have you. They need us now more than they ever have." Marcus gazed at the list. 15 names, 15 fellow guardians, scattered like quiet stars across the western states. 15 souls who had made the very same choice, who shouldered the same incredible burden, and who knew that true protection demanded secrecy, and that secrecy often meant a profound loneliness. And yet, it wasn't the same crushing loneliness he'd known before. It wasn't the hollow echo that had defined the 3 years since Linda's passing. This was a purpose. This was a meaning. This was a reason to rise with the sun that went beyond mere habit and raw stubbornness. He clicked reply. His fingers typed just 3 words. "I am in." Marcus sent the message before a moment's hesitation could take root. He closed the laptop and walked to the window, watching as the falling snow transformed his familiar world into a landscape that was strange, beautiful, and utterly new. Buster pressed against his leg, a presence that was warm, solid, and wonderfully uncomplicated. A good dog never questions the choices you make. They simply stand by you, their loyalty, an unwavering truth. "We have work to do, old friend." Marcus whispered to the dog, to himself, and to the spirit of the wife who taught him that the world is filled with things that defy logic, but matter all the same. "We had better get to it." The snow continued its silent fall. The forest held its ancient secrets close, and Marcus Thompson, the guardian, maintained his watch. In the months that came after, his life found a new rhythm. Marcus learned the cadence of protection, diligently reviewing trail camera footage from Jake, noting any unusual patterns, and subtly steering curious hikers from the most sensitive areas. He connected with the other guardians, a fellowship of whispers sharing information and coordinating their quiet defenses when a threat loomed. Kyle Scott never returned to that forest. Word reached Marcus through Madison that he'd accepted a position in Portland, trading the mountains for the city. Whether it was the trauma of his experience or a newfound wisdom, Marcus never knew. He didn't need to. The outcome was all that mattered. Ryan Walker's proposed research became ensnared in university red tape for 6 long months before it was quietly archived. The last Marcus heard, Walker had turned his attention to different projects, to other mysteries. Perhaps Sarah's subtle intervention had been successful, or perhaps Walker's interest had simply waned. In either case, the expedition never materialized. Spring arrived, melting into a verdant summer. The forest moved through its eternal cycles, utterly indifferent to human dramas, continuing to host a life that flourished in the shadows and endured through its silence. Marcus would catch fleeting glimpses, a flicker of movement between the pines, an impossible track left in the mud, signs that they were still out there, still surviving, still holding faith that their guardians would keep them safe. On the anniversary of Linda's death, Marcus hiked to the very spot where he had first discovered the young ones caught in the wire. The fence was completely gone now. He had dismantled all of it, having decided that some boundaries do more harm than good. The land felt different without the scar of the wire, more wild, more complete. He sat on a moss-covered log, his breathing heavy from the ascent, and took out the carved stone that was now his constant companion. He traced its ancient symbols with fingers that were beginning to betray his age, a touch of arthritis setting in, joints that grumbled at the changing weather, his skin growing thinner, as if the very barrier between him and the world was wearing away. A sound drew his eyes upward. The mother stood at the edge of the trees, perhaps 50 yards distant. She was by herself, observing him with those profoundly intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a universe of understanding. She had aged too. Marcus saw it in the deliberate, slightly slower grace of her movements. They were growing old in parallel, the two of them, each trying to protect a world that felt more fragile with every passing year. She did not come closer. There was no need. She simply stood there for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement flowing between them like a current. Then, just as quietly, she was gone, melting back into the shadows that were both her sanctuary and her shield. Marcus remained seated until the sun began to dip below the ridgeline, thinking of Linda, of purpose, and of the strange, winding paths down which grief can lead a person. He pondered how a deep loneliness could be forged into guardianship, how a devastating loss could blossom into a lasting legacy. When he finally rose to his feet to leave, his knees creaking in protest and his back lodging a complaint, he felt something that had been absent for 3 long years. It wasn't quite happiness. It was something deeper, quieter. Perhaps it was contentment. It was the feeling that his life, even in this pared down, solitary form, still had weight. It still meant something more than just marking the days until he could join Linda, wherever she was. He walked back to his cabin as twilight painted the sky. Buster greeted him at the door, his tail a happy metronome. Inside, the wood stove was cold, but it would roar to life soon enough. The promise of coffee waited on the counter. Another evening stretched out before him, and another day would follow. And then however many more he was meant to have. And through every single one of them, he would keep his watch. He would keep the secret. He would keep the promise he had made not with words, but with his heart, on a frigid February morning when he chose compassion over caution. The world had no need for knowledge of such wonders. The wonders themselves simply needed to survive, to remain sacred and untouched. That was the profound lesson. That was his ultimate purpose. That was the solemn weight Marcus Thompson would shoulder for all his remaining years. He brewed his coffee, fed his loyal companion, and tended to the hearth's steady flame. He let the evening bleed into the deep of night, as the forest beyond his window clutched its secrets tight, trusting that somewhere in the vast darkness, fellow sentinels kept their vigil. And with the morning's light, he would begin it all anew. Because this was the covenant of the guardians. They were present. They were vigilant. They shielded what needed shielding, especially when no one else even knew it was there to be lost. The stone in his pocket radiated a gentle, living warmth. The fire in his stove burned with a constant, reassuring heart. And Marcus Thompson, at 63 years of age, keeper of impossibilities made real, settled into his chair with the quiet fulfillment of a man who had found his calling in the last place he'd ever thought to look. In the twilight expanse between the known and the unknown, between the proven and the believed, between the human and something else entirely, life persisted, hidden, guarded, enduring, and that was more than enough. In truth, that was everything.